Power is absolute justice and the only one in the world. Power cannot be conquered by anything else, and if you have it, it makes you powerful. With this idea, demons fight to the last drop of blood, like fanatics, and this usually lasts an unbearably long time because it is this race that considers strength to be its natural gift. At the moment of birth, about 520 years ago, he appeared who had no equal, and it was immediately demonstrated. He was the king of demons who crushed enemies and united the world. It was the most powerful demon that had ever appeared in this world. It looked like a young guy with lush blonde hair, 2 pairs of horns and small fangs. The name of the new demon king is Hiram. After 20 years of his reign, Hiram, the demon king, decides to challenge the demon god himself, ignoring his power and untouchability. At that time, the demon god appeared in a spiritual shell in this world and addressed the demon king. He said that Hiram, even being a king, must submit to the divine will of God. Hiram received a divine decree: sacrifice 100 subjects every day. These were the conditions of the king's rule, but for Hiram, at some point, this became too much. Hiram said that the earth is a world of fleshly bodies that belong only to him, and he considers them his property. God can go into his own spiritual world and seek offerings there or find someone else. The demon god was furious when he heard this addressed to him. Hiram's words were respectful, rude, and also arrogant, which the god himself noticed. He said that by doing so, Hiram was challenging him. God was sure that Hiram would die, and then his overwhelming power as a demon god was released into the world where they were. At that moment, the demon god's spiritual body took on a physical form. Even having taken on a body here, it was several times larger than Hiram himself, and the god looked like a large fire elemental. The god smiled as he finished his transformation and turned to Hiram. The deity promised that Hiram would now learn the difference between a demon and a god. Hiram smiled slightly and said that he should watch his language. This is how the great battle that would go down in history began, between the powerful demon king and the demon god who came to this world to punish the disobedient. And yet, the demon king's all-crushing magic clashed with the demon god's divine miracles again and again, all the while putting up a worthy and equal resistance. But there was one detail. Hiram possessed a variety of magic, for which he was considered the strongest of demons and became king. He had excellent protection, which helped resist the attacks of the god. These were absolutely different tricks and techniques. What Hiram himself did not demonstrate, each time surprising the god more and more with his talents and skills. The battle itself lasted 3 days and 3 nights, bringing more and more disasters and panic to the earth. God and Hiram were both very strong, but in that battle there could only be one winner between these two. And soon, after 3 full days, which kept the whole world of demons in interest, the winner was brought out, and it was Hiram. He completely destroyed the body of the god of demons, which soon appeared before him on earth. Hiram said that it was natural that the incarnation in a bodily form greatly limited the god and did not allow his power to be fully revealed. The incarnation was the reason for his defeat. God could not believe that he had suffered a defeat. His physical shell was gradually disintegrating, and he continued to be indignant, calling what had happened absurd. The deity said that Hiram was very proud and foolish for a king. The god began to chuckle slightly, saying that a demon could not defeat a god whom he directly ruled. Hiram then said that this is how he defeated him. God repeated that Hiram is only a demon, and in any case he cannot escape from the divine rule. He is born a demon, this is the reason for his defeat. But God said that Hiram could now be proud that he had cornered him in this battle, but the king was born a demon, and that was the reason for his defeat, and now Hiram must die. Hiram's body began to disintegrate. It was as if he was turning into sand, which was disintegrating and turning into 1,000 tiny grains that were about to scatter in the wind. The demon king couldn't believe what was happening to him. He looked at his hands, which continued to disintegrate, and shouted that he didn't understand what the demon god had done to him. The deity, laughing maliciously, said that he never thought that he would ever have to apply divine punishment to an earthly being, because before everything had been done without it. God explained that these were not just beautiful words. It was God who controlled the demon race and could take their lives according to his own will, so he was always higher than Hiram. He looked again towards Hiram, who continued to slowly disintegrate, and repeated again that the demon king, with this protest and his prank, had only shown the stupidity that had destroyed him. Hiram got angry, but he couldn't do anything. At some point, only the head remained of the demon king, which continued to cast its angry gaze in the direction of the god. And then, after a few more moments, the body of the demon king completely dissolved in this earthly space, and no one knew where what was left of him would end up. In the place where this battle took place, not so far away, a white gate appeared and began to slowly open. The silhouette of one of the king's subjects appeared from them. In appearance, it was one of the very young demons. He looked like a child who, like Hiram, had blonde hair, was dressed in a cloak, and wore a small ring around his neck. The young demon, after being able to open the gates, which were huge for his size, seeped into them and immediately rushed very quickly to the body of his king, not believing in his defeat. The demon clutched his king's cloak, fingering the remains, which resembled little more than stones, in his hands. The creature could not hold back its tears, and whispered the name of its master. Still sitting on his knees, the little demon cried harder and harder, trying to find answers to how Hiram could have failed in trying to protect his subjects from being sacrificed. Meanwhile, in the dark and quiet room, a certain sphere appeared, having a material shell. It resembled a geometric figure with many edges painted with symbols. Afterwards, around the center, where something was clearly located, various magic circles began to appear, filled with various symbols and text that did not belong to any earthly people. All these circles were wrapped around the child, who was in the very center. It was as if he had just been born inside this sphere, having come into this world from a completely unknown universe. It had been a long time since the death of the demon king Hiram. It was a remote place, a month's walk or 2 months' sailing from the castle of the king himself, who had once been defeated. It was there, in a dark room, in the wilderness, on the floor lay a white stone, painted with various symbols. This stone was a regular dodecahedron with Shinto writing engraved on it. The baby that was born spoke to the sky and the earth. He said that his name was Hiram. Even before he lost the battle with the demon god, he was preparing the form for reincarnation. But Hiram was going to defeat him, but he was still a god, so the king had to take into account the possibility of defeat. As a result, the king, after long training, created this stone. After reincarnation, one can only inherit the soul and mind, as well as the spells that were closely connected to the soul of the one who is going to be reincarnated. In other words, after reincarnation, a new body and brain are created. And until the soul and mind are fully fixed in the new body, then thoughts will be completely disordered. If this was really so, Hiram understood that he could die even from hunger. The king didn't have much time there to go through the whole life path from a small child again, waiting for his growth, so he used accelerated growth magic. After Hiram cast this spell, he experienced extreme pain. It felt like every bone in his body was broken, and he had never thought it could hurt so much before. The room where the rebirth stone was located was specially built and prepared for reincarnation. Hiram stood up and with a spell called forth a light that illuminated the dark spaces. The king prepared her and enchanted the room with a protective seal, and also immediately prepared clothes for himself. Hiram went to a small chest of drawers and began to dress in a luxurious outfit. Afterwards, the king began to look around. He could not understand how much time had passed since his death and wanted to find out. In theory, he was supposed to be reborn 10 years after his death. But given that the magic of reincarnation was unimaginably complex, it did not require a very precise calculation, so the king himself was not sure that exactly 10 years had passed. As Hiram approached the exit, he found that the seal was intact, which pleased him. Having opened it, he was now fully prepared to receive an answer to his question regarding the time that had passed. When the Demon King learned that not 10 or even 100 years had passed, but 500, it left him in a state of great shock. He had guessed that magic was difficult, but he had never thought that it could fail him so badly. Most likely, the race change to human led to a failure of the magic formula, during which the process of duration was disrupted. But Hiram deliberately wanted to change his race, because there were reasons for that. God's punishment was killing demons with a snap of his fingers. Knowing this, he adjusted the formula right before his death so as not to bear various consequences in his new body. The human race was considered the strongest that could possibly exist, because it had no divine protection, so these creatures took a very long time to mature and lived very little compared to others. If a race has its own god, then it has more different magical powers. The more magic, the slower the aging process and the longer the body lives. Accordingly, those who did not have God did not have time to become strong. But the human race had a huge potential for development, and that is why, if you managed to preserve your experience and memory, you could discover that people are the strongest race. This was the key argument when Hiram chose the race for reincarnation. But there were no examples of this before. Hiram's body changed, his horns disappeared, and he realized that his plan had succeeded. He looked at himself for a long time and intently, still not accepting the shell in which he had now been reborn, but for now he liked everything and he studied his new body with special interest. Now he wanted to check whether he was the strongest or not. Even though 500 years had passed, his goal was still the same and he wanted only one thing, to kill the demon god. When he approached the door, he still found that the seal on the outside was missing. Although he had applied it on both sides, he guessed that there might be those who tried to enter his vault. When Hiram opened the gates, he was immediately greeted by a stream of warm wind. The boy opened his eyes wide, surprised that very close in front of him was something else that he did not expect to see at all. Behind the gate that swung open, the image of a girl with long blonde hair immediately appeared before Hiram's eyes. Her ears were pointed, like an elf's, and it was a surprise for him to see someone here. Surprised to meet a man in these parts, the girl could not say anything coherent for a long time, but soon she pulled herself together and asked the guy what he was doing here. She continued, becoming more assertive. Then she said that if the boy stayed here, he could die, which he most likely did not know. She continued to look at the boy. After hearing this, he was quite calm. The girl said that a dangerous dragon sleeps on this mountain, which can threaten everyone who is nearby. After a couple more seconds, the guy decided to say something. He, remaining completely calm, decided to find out who was standing in front of him, but first introduced himself, saying that his name was Hiram. The girl said that she was Lumiere, and she had come here to kill the dragon. Then a strange, not very loud sound was heard, which did not last long. It came from the girl's bracelet. She raised her hand to her ear and answered, finding out why she was being disturbed. After a short conversation, the girl said that she understood everything and would be vigilant. She lowered her hand again, turned her head to the guy and addressed him by the name he called her. The girl said that she had an urgent matter at the moment. This meant that she would not be able to take him to the foot of the mountain, but she thought that the guy could handle it himself, asking him anyway. Hiram was surprised by this question. He looked at the girls and tried to be tactful, so he also calmly answered that he could handle this task on his own. The girl began to walk away into the forest. She raised her hand and told Hiram not to take any risks, and if he waited here where they met, she would take him when she was done. She also asked him to promise her not to go up the mountain under any circumstances, saying again that it was very dangerous. Hiram smiled, raised his hand in response, and said that he would be fine. After the girl disappeared among the trees, Hiram turned to the mountain and said that the dragon would be a much more interesting activity for him now than the descent to the foot. He looked again at the huge mountain that was clearly visible ahead. Judging by its size, it was obvious that it was most likely inhabited by a representative of the strongest ancient dragons. When Hiram was looking for signs of power around him, he felt the powerful magic of a high dragon. Judging by the amount of magic, it was indeed one of the strongest dragons. Hiram headed towards the mountain thinking that this was exactly what he needed now. After all, he had only recently reincarnated after so many years and was not yet accustomed to magic. And fighting, as a rule, was the best way to master magic, as the Demon King himself considered. He made his way into the gorge that was in the mountain and began to make his way through the darkness through the stone irregularities. Hiram stood before the huge serpent and spread his arms. The dragon was perhaps 100 times larger than him, but Hiram still said that he would not mind trying his strength against the monster. As soon as the dragon saw the man who came into his lair and felt at home, it got angry. The next moment, he opened his mouth and was ready to burn the uninvited guest. After the stream of fire attacked Hiram, he used a protective spell that stopped the stream and left the Demon King completely unharmed. When the dragon saw that Hiram was repelling his fire attack, he thought that he could end the confrontation with a blow of his paw, which would surely crush the young man, but Hiram stopped it with one hand. He held back the entire onslaught with one hand, not allowing the dragon's paw to move an inch closer. The dragon was extremely surprised by the strength that a human could possess. Hiram raised his head and looked at the dragon, who continued to be amazed. He smiled and said that the dragon's movements were magnificent, but apparently it was not enough. But the ancient dragon was a very powerful creature, and it was not going to give up so easily. The creature continued to attack, once again directing its fiery breath towards Hiram. This time, Hiram didn't defend himself, but simply jumped to the side, ready to attack. He bounced off a small ledge in the cave and rushed towards the dragon's tail. The fire was destroying everything in the cave. The flames were burning everything on the ground and also destroying the stones that surrounded the walls and hung from the ceiling, but this did not stop Hiram. Hiram foresaw this, and immediately, as the stream of flame began to approach him, he put up a shield, which again completely covered him, and the tongues of flame passed on different sides of the Demon King. The flow that was blocked by the shield partially returned, causing damage to the dragon. It swayed slightly on its paws, and the next minute its head rushed towards the stone base of the cave. Still in the dragon's mouth, Hiram grabbed the teeth and began to push them apart, opening the dragon's mouth, which slammed shut as it hit the stone floor. Then Hiram jumped out and using a little magic, while still holding the dragon by the teeth, he found support and began to lift its entire carcass up until the monster was completely above his head. After the dragon was already hanging completely perpendicularly in the air above the surface, Hiram directed it towards the ground, applying a good force. The dragon's body hit the floor with devastating force. After the dragon was thrown away, he continued to lie there with a heavy wheeze. He no longer had the strength to get up, and steam continued to emanate from his body in all directions. Hiram walked up to the dragon's body and climbed onto its head. He felt the power he had, but it was much better. And yet, the magic that improved the body was more effective than in his past life. Hiram was pleased with his victory. He clenched his fist and smiled slightly, because he was absolutely right about the human race having a huge potential that could be developed further. But the dragon was not going to give in so easily. He pulled himself together, bared his teeth viciously, and decided that he would attack again, no matter what it cost him. The dragon threw the Demon King off of itself and opened its mouth, possibly its last attack. It thought it had caught the man off guard, so it was now very vulnerable. Hiram smiled, giving the dragon his due, and summoned one of his magical seals. The magical force that burst from this seal pressed the dragon to the ground, breaking the soil beneath him. After the dragon was pinned to the ground again, he bowed his head and said that his opponent was a very strong man. The dragon admitted his defeat and said that he could do whatever he wanted. Hiram, with a broad smile, told the dragon to rise. The Demon King was surprised that the creature knew human language and could communicate with him. The dragon said that he was an ancient species. Hiram noted that he was quite polite for a dragon and said that it was probably because he was young. The dragon replied that he was about 600 years old. He was indeed young, but already quite strong. The dragon asked the man why he had come and said that if he was interested in treasures, he could simply take them. But Hiram replied that he was not interested in the dragon's gold. The dragon bared his teeth and said that in that case, he had come for his body, and if that was the case, he could kill him faster and tear off his scales and fangs. Hiram looked up and thought that if the dragon was really telling the truth, those were very bold words. He always liked that kind of thing, so the Demon King decided that he wanted to be friends with him. The boy smiled and told the ancient dragon that he wanted to know his name. At first, the dragon was stunned, but there were no other options, and the dragon began to show more interest in all of this. Afterwards, the dragon stood up, slightly spreading his wings. He stood firm and said that he was an ancient fire dragon whose name was Yorm. Despite the fact that they had already talked, the dragon continued to look terrifying. Hiram was surprised and said that he did not think that such a young dragon as Yorm already had a nickname. The Demon King asked the dragon if he had taken away the nickname by winning, since that was how his line was named. The dragon was amazed by Hiram's wisdom. He sat down like an obedient dog and began to wag his tail. Afterwards, he said that it was the first time he had seen a man who knew so much. The dragon bowed his head and asked the man if he could now hear his name, to which the answer came almost immediately. The man said that his name was Hiram. The dragon's eyes widened and he was very shocked to meet Hiram. The dragon decided to clarify. He said that it was unthinkable, but Hiram was the great king of demons. The ancient serpent began to bend its head towards the man. Hiram began to push it away slightly and confirmed the dragon's guess that he was the king of demons. The dragon began to sum up, saying that he had succeeded in reincarnating. He realized that the Demon King had activated resurrection magic before his death. Hiram was surprised that the dragon knew him. The dragon said that of course he knew the man. He recalled the first time in history that a demon almost defeated a demon god and said that this story was famous even among the ancient dragons. The dragon thought for a moment and said that most likely this was the reason for his living here, in this mountain, by order of his father. Hiram was surprised that it was the order of his father Jorma, and he decided to ask when it was. The dragon said that it happened about 500 years ago, when he still lived with him. He said that he had already seen Hiram and he really looked like the great king. Afterwards, he said that Hiram should remember Jormungandr, who was Jorm's father. Hiram was surprised by what he heard. The dragon said that because when he was little he managed to catch the king of demons. The great king Jormungandr is the name of an ancient dragon with whom Hiram fought many battles in the struggle for power. It was the strongest dragon he fought in those days. The dragon was not only his vassal, but also his loyal friend and advisor. Jormungandr was the eldest of the ancient dragons and was tens of thousands of years old. He possessed great strength and wisdom. Hiram himself turned to his friend for advice more than once. Perhaps this is why Jormungandr sent his son to guard Hiram, although he did not give him the order to do so. Hiram said that now he remembered everything because it was Jormungand who had advised Hiram to become a man. The dragon bowed his head again and addressed the man by his title, saying, "Your Majesty." Hiram recalled the moment when he was in his chambers and Jormungand leaned over to him and said that if the Demon King was defeated in battle with the Demon God, then he would need to be reborn as a human. At the time, Hiram thought it would be too risky. After all, reincarnation magic in general was quite complicated, so the chance of success was not great at all. In addition, if you change your race, the chance is even lower, so Hiram prepared a formula for reincarnation into a demon, but at the moment when he was supposed to die, he changed his magic. One of the main reasons he decided to become human was because of Jormungandr's advice. Hiram scratched his head and said that he thought he had been defeated in that fight, but he earned the nickname Demon Godslayer. The dragon said that Hiram did indeed die first, but there was something else that he probably didn't know. After God's punishment, not only the demon god's body was destroyed. Jorm said that after the god cast a spell on Hiram, his spiritual body suffered as much as his physical body. Hiram stared at Jorm, surprised by what he heard. When Jorm said this, he fell silent and stared at the Demon King. Hiram cried out in impatience and told the ancient dragon to tell him everything in detail. Jorm continued, saying that God's punishment is a terribly powerful spell, but its consequences are also enormous. If you hit so hard, you can hurt yourself. At this point, Hiram wondered if God's punishment was applicable to the human race at all, to which Jorm replied that it was not, for divine blessing was like a collar. Therefore, divine punishment can only be used on creatures with a blessing. Hiram could not stand it and continued to shout, demanding to know further the fate of the demon god after the magic. Jorm said that his father assumed that the demon god had created a cocoon for himself and was hiding in it. Jormungand also said that his spirit was so damaged that he was on the verge of death and could not return to the divine world. Hiram bowed his head, considering these words. He thanked the ancient dragon for providing him with such an informative account. Therefore, the god must be hiding somewhere in the physical world. Afterwards, the dragon said that he was always at your service, after which he bowed his head and placed it on the ground next to the Demon King. Sadness appeared in the dragon's eyes, and Hiram did not understand the reason for this. Hjorm said that he saw no shame in being defeated by the great Demon King, and then he remarked that he was glad that Hiram was the last one the ancient dragon saw. Hiram said that he was not joking or lying when he noted the strength of the young ancient dragon, so he could not reproach himself for the defeat he suffered. Jorm closed his eyes and thanked Hiram, saying that it was an honor to hear this. He asked that if Hiram ever met his father, he could tell him that his son had fought bravely and now he was ready to die. Hiram said that he did not need the body of the ancient dragon. After they talked and it turned out that Jorm is the son of a vassal and loyal friend of Jormungand, he can now serve the king. Hiram said that he would need help because he was going to conquer the world. The dragon was glad to hear this, but he still asked Hiram if he had heard right. Hiram spread his arms wide and said that first he would finish off the demon god, and then he would go off again to conquer this world as he had done before. Jorm, realizing that Hiram's intentions were quite serious, said that he was ready to step over the pride of the ancient dragon and would now serve the Demon King, like his father. As he spoke these words, small light impulses began to appear on his body. It was clear that the dragon had used magic, and soon his entire body was illuminated with light and he rose up. Finally, in his menacing voice, he said that he would go with Hiram, calling him his king. As the light began to fade, Hiram saw that Jorm had shrunk in size, becoming like a tiny dragon. Jorm climbed onto his king's shoulder. Hiram noted that the ancient dragon was very agile, to which Jorm smiled and said that he was the most agile of the ancient dragons. Raising his eyes, Jorm was already waiting for further instructions from his king, but Hiram said that there would be none for now. Initially, they had to find the location of the demon god. The dragon opened his mouth wide and exclaimed that there were now many treasures in the cave. Jorm advised to use them as soon as the Demon King wished. Hiram asked Jorm if he was sure, because collecting treasures is a very important hobby for dragons, and Hiram did not want to appropriate everything for himself, depriving his new servant of this business. But Jorm said that he did not like treasures, and he had said before that he was ready to give everything. He said that all these coins were the king's inheritance, to which Hiram thought that Jormungandr knew where the king's hiding place was. Jorm and Hiram began to examine all the treasures that were in the cave. The guy was surprised by the number of things and thought that it was all from his hiding places. The ancient dragon said that he himself had collected something from the surrounding area. Afterwards, Jorm flew up to one of the things and began to pull it out. He noted that this thing had a cool shape. Jorm did like treasure items, after all. All those shiny things with strange shapes, although, in truth, each dragon had his own tastes. Hiram sat down and began to examine the things that were lying there in more detail. As it turned out, Jormungand had collected everything from the hiding places and left it to Jorma. He had lived here even before his father's disappearance. Jormungandr also said that different artifacts have interesting effects, but the most interesting was the meeting with Hiram himself. Hiram thought that he built the nest to guard his tomb. And then he left Jorm as soon as he grew up. Hiram was curious about what Jormungandr had planned. The Demon King hoped that he would be able to see them in the near future. After a short time, Hiram continued to study the treasure, and the dragon was digging somewhere nearby. Jorm flew up, holding a small necklace, and said that his father told him to take care of this thing. Hiram turned, recognizing the pendant the ancient dragon was carrying. He called out that he wished to see it. Jorm flew closer and handed the necklace to its owner. The Demon King carefully took the necklace in his hands and said that it seemed like he had once given it to Philphy as a talisman. That was the reason why it was important to protect it. Hiram himself wore it in his past life. It was a magical tool that helped find Philip when she was lost, and the color of the light indicated her condition, or rather, the level of magic. Hiram kept an eye on Philphy because she was a demoness with great potential. The level of magic determines the lifespan, and Hiram would not be surprised if she was still alive. The necklace emitted a green light that shimmered on the surface of the stone. Hiram realized that Philphy was alive, but he could not see her location, which was strange. Then Hiram turned to Jorm, asking him if his father had told him anything about Philphy, but Jorm did not understand what was being discussed and said that he had never heard anything like that from his father. Hiram looked at the necklace for a moment, then began to put it on his neck. Jorm noticed that the Demon King's face changed into his emotions, where the dragon saw sadness. The guy said that he was not sad at all, but rather the opposite. He was very happy that Philphy was still alive, so he thought that she should be found by him too. The Demon King smiled, then turned to Jorm and shared this with him. Hiram said that they would find both Philphy and the demon god. The ancient dragon supported his king. Then Jorm opened his mouth, flying very close to Hiram, and let out a small burst of fire in approval. He said that he would do everything in his power, and Hiram nodded, counting on the dragon. In the treasury was an important magical item called the magic bag. It had a huge capacity, and yet it never felt heavy. Hiram leaned over to the treasure, opened the bag, and said that he would take all the treasures that Jormungand had left for him here. He cast one of his spells and all the riches poured into the bag. After Hiram stepped out into the fresh air, he spread his arms wide and took in the mountain freshness with full lungs. Jorm hovered right next to him. After a short stop, they looked around together and chose a direction. Hiram shouted that it was time for them to go, and Jorm supported the Demon King, shouting, "Forward." Meanwhile, the girl Hiram had met when leaving his reincarnation room was fighting a huge monster armed with a massive club. At some point, while delivering another blow, the monster parried her blow with his weapon, after which the elf jumped to the side. She looked at her blade, and it cracked. The girl continued to look at her sword, absolutely not believing her eyes. She was in a hopeless situation, and at that moment, the huge monster was already getting closer and closer to her. Jorm and Hiram had already descended the mountain and were walking along the forest path. The ancient dragon was flying nearby and said that if they went straight along this road, they would be able to find the city in the near future. The Demon King was enjoying the weather. He threw his head back and wanted to know who ruled the lands now. Jorm replied that rumor had it that after Hiram's death, the country was divided and a war began. Suddenly, a loud noise was heard ahead. Hiram shouted Jorma's name, calling him to be ready. As they moved forward, they saw an orc standing with a club at the ready. Jorm and Hiram stood a short distance away, where the orc had not yet seen them. The ancient dragon thought that this monster was quite large for an orc, to which Hiram replied that it was probably their lord. Jorm didn't understand why the orc lord was just standing on the road. He had never seen such monsters appear on the highway like that before. Hiram suggested getting off the road. But as soon as Hiram put on his hood and was ready to move in another direction, they saw the same girl who was ready to draw her sword and shouted her name. Lumiere Ortwile said menacingly that it was her duty to take the life of the orc lord, and then she drew her sword and pointed it towards the orc's head. Hiram recognized the girl, which surprised Jorm. The guy told him that he met Lumiere in front of the tomb. Then she said that she came to kill the ancient dragon. The girl looked quite self-confident. A fight began between the orc lord and Lumiere. The girl wielded her blade quite well, deftly dodging the blows of the monster's club. The orc lord was slowly becoming enraged at not being able to keep up with the nimble girl. He continued to swing his sword in different directions while Lumiere dodged and continued to inflict small wounds. Jorm noted, turning to his king, that this elf, although young, was already quite brave, like a real hero, so it was not surprising that she broke the seal of the tomb. After they watched part of the fight between the Orc Lord and Lumiere, the ancient dragon offered to help the girl because he believed that she would not be able to handle him alone. And then the moment happens when the girl's sword hits the Orc Lord's club and begins to crumble. The girl was shocked by this, because her sword was magical. At that moment, she thought that she might have been sold a fake sword and immediately urged herself not to take her eyes off her opponent. She rushed to attack again, even with a broken sword. It was rather strange, for elves are the people who are skilled in magic, but this girl went on the attack with a broken sword. She thrust it into the orc's chin, but he immediately threw her back with a blow of his hand. Hiram thought that heroes didn't like to use regular magic. They were only interested in powerful and unique spells. Maybe even she couldn't use elven magic. So the moment came when it was necessary to intervene, and Hiram agreed. At the moment of swinging the club, when the girl was already unarmed and lying on the ground, he stopped the attack of the Orc Lord with one hand. Lumiere didn't expect anyone to help her now. The next moment, Hiram aimed his other hand towards the Orc Lord's chest and pierced his flesh. The Orc Lord didn't even have time to sway before the boy was already pulling his hand back. It contained the Orc Lord's heart, which Hiram immediately squeezed tighter and it burst. So the Orc Lord was defeated. His body fell to his knees, and in the middle of his chest was visible a huge hole. Hiram waved his hand and walked towards the elf. When he approached, he immediately smiled and said that if she could not use magic, then she should at least buy herself a good sword, because she would not be able to fight. Lumiere, she said it was just amazing. Hiram gave the girl his hand so she could get up off the ground. Lumiere gave him her hand and started to stand up, trying to thank her savior along the way. She was very grateful. Hiram smiled again and said that it was all nonsense. The girl continued to be surprised and noted that Hiram probably trained for a long time since he was so strong. Hiram nodded his head and modestly said that it was so. Lumiere looked into the guy's eyes and confidently said that now she owed him her life and would never forget it. Hiram said he took this as information and then began to question the girl. He was curious about this country. He pretended, saying that he had lived in the mountain wilderness since birth and had only just managed to get out. Since Hiram had only saved her, the elf was glad to help him and said that she would tell him everything she knew. At that moment, Jorm and Hiram's attention was drawn to a noise from the forest thicket. Even several trees were felled. The boys saw that the roar that arose during the battle had attracted many orcs who were most likely subordinate to the lord killed by Hiram. Jorm flew up a little, ready to fight back. Hiram, however, remained calm and asked the girl how she could have offended the orcs so much, but she denied everything. Lumiere awkwardly turned away and told them that on the way to the dragon, they met a merchant who immediately asked them for help. The girl agreed to fulfill the order. Hiram did not understand what the merchant asked for, and the elf explained that the merchant complained about the Orc Lord who blocked their way at the tavern, so the girl volunteered to help. Hiram nodded his head approvingly and said that in that case the girl should go and help them, and he would take care of the rest. He took a sword from his bag and handed it to the girl. The guy said that without a sword she wouldn't be able to protect anyone. Lumiere wanted to object, but the guy said that she didn't need to think about him. He had already shown her how strong he was, and he could handle it now. Lumiere accepted the gift that Hiram gave her and began to gradually take steps back, without turning away from the boy. She said that she trusted him and thanked him again for giving her the sword. Then she turned, tucked her sword into her belt and ran towards the merchants she wanted to help. Hiram turned to Jorm and apologized since it was his sword, but Jorm said it was okay. After Lumiere moved away, Hiram was ready. He turned towards the thicket and the orcs were already running in a crowd towards the Demon King. Hiram looked around the crowd, bowing his head. Jorm expected Hiram to start moving quickly or to take out some kind of weapon or maybe even use powerful magic like in the fight with him, but Hiram called out the number 102 and began to charge a magical charge. No, still 104. Meanwhile, the charge grew larger and larger, expanding in the Demon King's hand. The orcs were already one step away from Hiram and surrounded him from all sides, swinging swords and axes. The Demon King continued to stand still, and Jorm was surprised that he was going to use elemental magic. The orc army was already blocking the light that fell on the dragon and the king from above. They were greedily climbing on top of each other, wanting to avenge their lord. Jorm was scared. He was worried about Hiram. But soon, when the charge was ready, Hiram suddenly raised his hand and shouted the spell, 104 shots. The magic that Hiram was preparing flew out to the sides and attacked every orc that was nearby. The magical charge struck all the orcs that were advancing on Hiram and Jorm. The army froze and began to sink downwards, falling to the ground, and soon their bodies began to dissolve into the air. Hiram continued to hold the charge, entering the battlefield, his face looking slightly mad at this point, while Jorm was nearby and never ceased to be amazed at the strength of his king. Jorm stared at the scorched earth and told Hiram that it was amazing. To him, the number of shots was simply outrageous, but Hiram reminded him that it was elemental magic. Hiram turned and walked in the other direction, saying that they were done here and now it was time to find Lumiere. Jorm confirmed, saying that although he did not like heroes, the girl had valuable information for them. Meanwhile, taking out her sword that Hiram had given her, Lumiere fought off the orcs, protecting several men who were behind her. The merchants looked scared. The girl screamed and went on the attack, tightly gripping the handle of the blade. There were about 5 orcs, but there was no hesitation in the elf's eyes, for there really was some kind of heroism in her. She wielded her blades masterfully, dealing deadly blows to the orcs one after another. At the same time, her defensive skills were also at their best, allowing her to evade oncoming blows in time and skillfully. Having struck one of them with a clear blow to the head, the girl abruptly pulled out her blade and immediately switched to the next one, cutting through his shoulder. The orc howled in pain, starting to fall back. But Lumiere saw it perfectly well and, having entered a battle trance, she could no longer stop. She jumped up with her sword, raising it high above her head and with one blow cut the orc in half. After Lumiere landed on the ground, the girl knew that the threat had been averted, but the next moment she felt pain in her back. Someone had fired a bolt from a crossbow, hitting her under the left shoulder blade. The elf did not expect such a turn of events. After all the orcs that were in the clearing had already been defeated, so who could have done this? She leaned on her sword, trying to stay on her feet. Grasping the blade, the girl's entire body was already pulling her to the ground, and her strength was gradually leaving. The wound was serious, then she decided to turn around and see where the bolt was fired from. The blade was pulled to the side and the girl slowly rolled onto the grass. The 3 merchants who stood behind and asked for help grinned, and one of them held the same crossbow in his hand. They started to move slowly towards the girl when one of them started to speak. He told the others that the girl was very stupid and did not immediately understand that she was being deceived. The man told the others that it was time to get out of here. But before they left, they approached the girl and surrounded her. One of the merchants with a black eye patch grabbed the girl's sword and said that it was quite good and could be sold for a lot at the market. The second man pushed the girl's body to the ground with his foot and said that they would leave her here to feed the orcs. Someone sarcastically objected that it would be a shame to leave such beauty here. Exhausted, Lumiere grabbed the grass with her hands, trying to hold on. She didn't understand why they treated her like that, how here, behind her back, someone said that he had never had fun with an elf. Hearing the girl's question, who wanted to find out the reason for the merchant's actions, they suddenly became angry. One of them, who was leading the others, leaned over the girl. He grabbed her face, lifted her head, and then began to look for his knife, which he immediately pulled out. He brought it to the elf's face and said with a smile that they were doing all this for money and fun. He laughed loudly and leaned a little closer and said that he couldn't wait to see the despair in the eyes of a man who didn't work for them, because for them it was a special pleasure. He continued to move his rusty blade near Lumiere's nose and spoke, drawing her out emotionally. He asked the girl what it felt like to be destroyed by the one she was trying to protect. Afterwards, he squeezed the girl's face tighter and shouted emotionally, calling the girl an elven princess. The girl was in despair, but at the same time she tried to hold on, not showing her emotions to the merchants. Everyone was very amused by this, but then quiet steps were heard from behind and someone shouted towards the merchant with the knife to disappear. It sounded very confident and made the company tense up. Everyone was shocked that someone would dare to interrupt their fun. They turned to look at the guy who was walking towards them. Some of the bandits in the group realized that they were in the majority, so they started shouting at the intruder. Hiram stood before a group of bandits, his hands in his pockets, and on his shoulder sat a small Jorm, who was looking at the group of people with displeasure. The same leader who held Lumiere by the face raised his dagger and said that the traveler looked weak, but he was young, so they could sell him for good money as a slave. The next moment, the leader of the merchants shouted to the others to seize the young man. Hiram, hearing this, smiled and said that the man was quite clever and he was ready for their challenge. As soon as the leader of the merchants began to approach Hiram, he lowered his blade and was going to simply grab the guy and knock him down, but Hiram immediately objected, sending a blow with his right hand right into the bandit's nose. Hiram shouted that he got what he deserved, obviously playing with people. Two of the merchants, at whose feet the body of their comrade flew, were stunned by the blow, shouting that the young man even dared to do this. After the Demon King's blow, the merchant leader was still alive. He began to rise, leaning on one hand, and when he raised his head, he shouted that he would tear the young man apart. The others rushed to attack, drawing their swords. Three of the bandits rushed at Hiram, trying to come at him from different sides in order to carry out a simultaneous attack on the young man, who turned out to be not as weak as they had assumed. Hiram wasn't all that impressed. The young man's gaze was riveted to only one thing all this time. He was looking at the elf girl, who was lying on the ground with a crossbow bolt sticking out of her back. She was barely conscious. He approached Lumiere and asked if she was okay. Hiram tried to calm her down, saying that he was right there. The guy took his cape and handed it to the girl with a smile, wanting to cover her. The young man smiled, saying that everything would be fine with them now and she could stop worrying. Now it was Hiram's turn to take care of her again because the girl had impressed him with her bravery. Lumiere looked up at Hiram, who was trying to help her. She wrapped herself in the cloak he had given her and very quietly spoke words of gratitude to her savior. It was as if Hiram had fallen in love with her. He crouched down next to her and slowly reached out his hand. He placed his hand on her forehead and paused for a moment. Then he slowly whispered, "Treatment." Meanwhile, Yorm was already nearby, flying towards his king. After Hiram spoke the spell, there was a bright flash near his hand, which at first frightened Lumiere. But after the flash died down, the girl began to sway, and with her last breath she said, thanking Hiram. She said that she felt much better now. Hiram was surprised, because the girl fainted after his spell. His healing spell was too strong, and the guy realized that he had to be more careful with it in the future. Demons had a hard time mastering healing magic, but now the boy was in a human body, so most likely his power of some spells increased. Hiram began to get back on his feet. The boy took a few steps towards the bandit leader, who was still alive and lying on the ground. Hiram sat on him, opening his bag. The bandit cried out in pain and asked why the man was protecting the elf. Hiram, going through the looted artifacts one by one, tried to figure out their value. He raised his head and asked the man, assuming they were slave traders. After a little rummaging through the backpack, Hiram's attention was drawn to one object. He began to take out this urn, on which an orc skull was depicted. Hiram immediately realized that this was a magical object for attracting orcs. Then, continuing to unload things from the backpack, Hiram saw something else very interesting. He dug around with his hand at the bottom and pulled out another object on a rope. It was an amulet to scare off orcs. It was then that the boy realized that this group of bandits were using these items to attract orcs, but at the same time to protect themselves. Then the Demon King understood everything. It was all a trap to kill Lumiere. Firstly, it was strange that the Orc Lord was standing in the middle of the road. Secondly, they suddenly attacked in a pack, and they did not attack them from the bandits' side. The merchant was also a bandit, and for bandits, magic items were an expensive pleasure. Most likely, they could have been given to them by some powerful magician who wanted Lumiere dead. After Hiram had a complete picture of the entire incident in his head, he bowed his head over the leader of the bandits who was below him, and then pressed his boot on his head. Hiram grabbed his face aggressively and decided that now he would get full answers to his questions. He shouted at the bandit, wanting to know who had arranged all this and hired their group. Hiram placed an urn in front of the thug that had magical properties to attract an army of orcs. Then he began to question the merchant about where they got these items. The merchant writhed in pain, but to the very end he said that he did not understand what he was talking about. He said that they had simply taken the bag from a passing magician who had been robbed. Hiram bowed his head and said that he did not understand at all the reason why he would cover for the customer. Hiram guessed that most likely it was a magician. The bandit screamed so loudly that Jorm, who was sitting on his head, covered his ears. But the merchant continued to say that he really did not know any magician. After Hiram finished with all the fingers on the bandit's hand, he thought that perhaps he really knew nothing, or perhaps he feared the magician more than death. Jorm thought it was quite possible. Hiram let go of the bandit's hands and began to stand up. He said that without this information, the city would be dangerous for the three of them. Afterwards, Hiram approached Lumiere and began to pick her up. The girl needed to be taken away from here, and then Yorm flew up to him. He said that they could spare the bandits. But Hiram turned to the ancient dragon and said he had an idea. He picked up the thing that scared the orcs off the ground and said they would take it with them. Jorm took up the idea, realizing that the urn for attraction would remain here. Hiram confirmed the guess and said that the rules always change. Survival depends only on luck. Soon, several orcs came to the clearing where the bandits were located, attracted by the magical artifact. The monsters were happy with such a find and quickly dealt with the people. After walking a few kilometers, the girl began to come to her senses. She opened her eyes and saw that Hiram was carrying her in his arms. Loomer did not expect this when she woke up. She turned to Hiram and began to try to get down. Lumiere said that she could stand up now, and then, with the boy's support, she began to lean on the ground. Hiram asked the girl if she was okay. As Lumiere immediately said that she was fine, she thanked Hiram for the sword he gave her and for his help. Hiram smiled and said that it was a trifle for him. He was ready to give her the sword because he felt no need for it and he had something else. The girl immediately objected, saying that the sword was very expensive and this was evident from its quality and various precious stones. Hiram said that if she wanted to return it, she would do it in the city. The girl adjusted her clothes a little and expressed her gratitude once more. She said that in that case they would do so and asked about that gang of traitors. Hiram took the sword from her and began to put it in his magic bag. He turned to the girl and said with a smile that the merchants were just a gang of robbers and nothing more. The young man said that perhaps the orcs had already eaten them, because he had seen several of them quite nearby. The girl's face showed that something had gone wrong, which Hiram immediately asked about. The girl turned away at some point, her hands clasped. Hiram said that they should return to the city. There they could take more people, for he would not be able to carry a dozen bodies on his back. At this point, the girl bowed her head and said that she didn't know about returning. She had a mission to kill an ancient dragon that she had to complete. Hiram turned to her and said he remembered her talking about it, and when Jorm heard about it, he quietly hissed that he didn't think she could handle him. Hiram smiled and said that the girl could rest easy. He climbed the mountain himself and spoke with the ancient dragon there, after which he forced him to leave the mountain. The girl couldn't believe her ears. She looked at the smiling Hiram in surprise and couldn't understand his words. She didn't understand how a person could talk to a dragon, after which he left his home. Afterwards, they went further along the path and Hiram said that now they could safely go to the city. But the girl said that she did not believe him and she needed some proof. Then Hiram turned, smiling at her again. He said that in that case, they needed a witness who could confirm all this. Then he pointed at Jorm and they laughed together. Afterwards, Hiram said that he would like to hear more about the country they were in. The girl remembered that she had promised to tell everything. After a short pause, she began. Almost immediately, she said that they were now in the kingdom of Ortvale. Hiram's eyes widened because he had already heard this name before, so he was very surprised. He turned to the girl and told her that that was her last name. She confirmed it, saying that she was the daughter of the king and the first princess of the kingdom. Hiram remembered that the bandits had called the girl a princess when he had approached them from behind the trees. In other words, they knew exactly who she was, which only confirmed his suspicions. Hiram turned to her and said that he wanted to hear the full story of the country the girl lived in. She smiled and said that she had promised, so she began telling the whole story at once. In the vastness of the great power that was able to annex and unite the continent about 100 years ago. The rulers of this power were precisely the Ortvale family, the elves. At that time, the elves were the most respected race of all on the continent, followed by the beastmen and dwarves. The lowest and weakest race was considered to be the human race because they did not have the divine blessing. The elves had been oppressing the human race for many years, and the girl was a member of the royal family, so she thought that the bandits hated her for this very reason. Hiram was impressed by what he had just heard. By that time, the girl, who had already come to her senses and was cured, stood up and told this information to the demon king, who had been reborn as a human. Lumiere pursed her lips and then crossed her arms over her chest. She really hoped that Hiram would be able to forgive her for having such a legacy. The guy turned to her and decided to clarify some points. He decided to ask the girl if she really hated the human race and wanted to subjugate them just like her ancestors did. But Lumiere immediately changed her emotions and said that it was not so at all. The assumption that Hiram made about her was wrong, so she tried to object. Hiram came closer, bowed his head a little and said that this is what the elven princess wanted to tell him. Lumiere began to speak very hesitantly, trying to explain her opinion. She said that she was a member of the royal family and she carried this burden of what her people did. She wanted to fix this situation, to stop the dominance of the elves, but she could not do anything. Hiram saw that the girl was speaking quite sincerely. He said that from his observations, the girl was not oppressing people at all, but on the contrary, she was trying to help them and provide protection, standing up for the merchants. The girl leaned towards Hiram and said in frustration that she had tried so many times, but all to no avail. She considered herself helpless in this situation. Hiram smiled in response to her telling him her story. The guy said that he had no reason to hate the girl, so he did not hold any grudge against her. The guy also said that among them, the elves, there are both bad and good representatives, just like among people, so it is quite normal, and he urged her not to be ashamed of it. Lumiere was amazed at how well Hiram understood everything, and it caused her nothing but positive emotions. She looked at the guy and smiled at him, thanking him again for his understanding. Afterwards, they set out together, and Hiram decided to find out something else for himself. He asked about the land of demons, and the girl said that according to rumors, there is a whole continent where only demons rule. The boy turned to the girl and said that earlier he noticed that Lumiere had not spoken about this race at all. He continued to pretend that he was just out of the wilderness and knew nothing. Lumiere didn't yet understand who was really in front of her, so she continued to believe the guy who had saved her from various scrapes several times. She said that there were very few demons here that she knew about. And now they were getting closer and closer to the city, which appeared from behind the hills they had passed. It was a large castle with a bunch of towers, well protected and surrounded by a strong wall on all sides. In fact, everything happened a long time ago. About 300 years ago, real historical upheavals took place on this continent, where the race of demons and elves participated. There was a brutal war between the demons and the elves. The demons were very strong and the elves suffered a lot from their attacks. There were real massacres between these two armies. But after Lumiere said that during the long struggle, the elves were still able to defeat the army of demons, and then they drove them out of the continent, completely seizing control over their great power. This event received wide publicity, and after what happened, the elves began to call it a holy war, because it was then that all the peoples of the elven race united and took back the continent for themselves. Meanwhile, they passed some workers who recognized their princess. They waved to her in a friendly manner, and while Lumiere responded with courtesy, Hiram thought about what had been said. Hiram continued walking forward when he heard a girl screaming behind him, calling for the Demon King. She caught up with him and, when she was level, smiled at him and began to continue their dialogue. Lumiere asked the guy if he knew where he would spend the night in the city, but the guy said that he had just come down from the mountains, so of course he had absolutely no plans. In that case, the girl turned to Hiram and said that he could stay at their home, in the royal family's quarters. The estate was large, so they could make room for him. Lumiere promised that Hiram could have a free bed, as well as a comfortable bathroom to wash up after his journey. Hiram said that sounded good. Lumiere was glad that the boy liked her proposal, and she said that in that case they decided everything. Hiram wondered if he could control her, and then said that he was glad to meet the princess. Hiram raised his arm up, making more room on his shoulder, and shouted to his dragon, Yoram, to come down with him. The dragon flew up and clung to his king's shoulder, bowing his head. The girl was impressed by what she saw. The little dragon seemed very cute to her, and she began to examine it. Hiram introduced his pet, repeating the name of the ancient dragon. It was the first time Lumiere had seen such a creature with her own eyes, and she also saw that the dragon was subservient to Hiram. She asked if she could pet this cute beast. Hiram smiled and said that he allowed it, which shocked the dragon slightly. They were getting closer and closer to the gates that marked the entrance to the huge elven city. Hiram noticed the flag fluttering in the wind above. He stared for a bit, and Jorm began to hide behind his master's shoulder from the girl. Lumiere said that there were 5 minutes left and they would be there. There were several well-armed guards at the gate, holding massive double-ended spears. Hiram and the girl were heading towards them, passing the rest of the people around them. Everyone was very friendly and sincerely welcomed the princess, happy to see her back. People waved and smiled. It was obvious that the Ortweil family was very honored and respected here. As soon as the boys entered the city, they were immediately surrounded by a crowd of joyful townspeople. They were really very happy to see her, shouting compliments and joyful speeches at her. The girl realized that she had really made him worry about herself. Meanwhile, Hiram was following her, holding the dragon on his shoulder. He was whistling a calm melody, looking around. The guards looked at the boy, not seeing any signs of a superior race on him. They exchanged tense glances, but Hiram continued to walk forward to where Princess Lumiere stood. The girl, seeing the boy approaching, turned and pointed at him with her hand. She urged the people to remain calm, saying that it was Hiram who had managed to convince the ancient dragon to leave the mountain. People immediately rushed to the guy, surrounding him from all sides. They thanked Hiram for taking care of the princess, because saving such a nobleman was considered a significant act. This continued for almost the entire journey as they walked through the main square of the city. Half an hour later, Hiram leaned against one of the walls and said that it was finally over and they had broken free from the crowd. He sighed heavily, then raised his head and continued walking. Jorm said that it was worth noting that the residents, who belonged to the human species, were very fond of the local princess Lumiel. Hiram continued to move forward heavily and told his dragon that in all this, no one had met a girl from the knightly order, which was very strange for a representative of the royal family. And so, after a little while, Lumiere raised her hand and shouted to Hiram that they had arrived. Joy was visible in her eyes. Apparently, the energy of the crowd was greatly charging her morale. The girl, as was customary for a hospitable hostess, continued to walk ahead, introducing her possessions. Hiram looked around the huge and beautiful mansion once again and paid tribute to the princess. The girl walked up to the door and then turned to the Demon King and said that she had received this house as her own when she moved to this city as the head of the knightly order. When the doors swung open, the maids were already standing at the entrance, all dressed neatly and identically. They wore black dresses and white aprons. They all greeted their mistress at the same time. Lumiere walked forward and then turned to her new guest and said that Hiram could make himself at home here from today onwards and was free to rest as much as he wanted. Looking around the house, the girl noticed that everything was ready for their arrival, as if the servants knew of her return. The girl said that dinner was already prepared for them so they could all sit down and have a snack together at one table. Jorm, who saw all this beauty, apparently got too hungry on the road, so he immediately rushed and jumped on the table, devouring everything in his path, which surprised Lumiere. Eating one dish after another, Jorm greedily rushed between the plates, pouncing on the delicacies. Soon, when he had emptied half the table, the dragon fell over and sighed heavily, which signified satiety. Lumiere was a very kind lady, so she helped her maids sort everything out. After order was restored, the girl approached Hiram and placed a cup of tea next to him. The freshly brewed tea was steaming hot. Hiram, as a true representative of nobility in a sense, carefully took the tea pair and began to drink the drink provided to him. After some time, the girl also sat down next to him and began to question Hiram. She noted that he was a representative of the human race and still had excellent command of healing magic, which surprised her. The guy, continuing to drink tea, said that there were various reasons for this. If we were to speak frankly, then one could assume that it was some kind of hardening that the guy receives during various battles. Then Hiram turned to the girl and said that she was asking him as if she was worried about the fact that she did not have any magic at all, being a representative of the elven race. There was a small silence between them. The girl didn't know how to react to the fact that she had been exposed. Meanwhile, Hiram looked at little Jorma, who continued to doze on the table. Soon the girl said that his assumptions were correct, because she really could not use magic. Royal blood obliged her to enter military service, where she was appointed the head of the Third Knightly Order. But since she did not possess magic, the knights did not obey her, and this was a problem in terms of managing the army. Soon she, the shame of the royal family, was called the Clumsy Princess. Hiram raised his head and said that now he understood everything. He made a guess, saying that this was the reason why the girl went to the mountains to tame the ancient dragon alone. At this point, Lumiere could not stand it any longer and stood up abruptly from her seat. The teacup she was holding fell to the floor and broke. Hiram was surprised by such a prank, and the girl addressed him by name. She cried out that she really wanted to learn magic. That's how she met Hiram on her way, and now she wants him to be the one to start studying it. The princess was ready for almost anything. Hiram did not expect this, so he continued to be surprised by the girl's proposal. He raised his head and asked the princess the reason why he should teach her how to handle magic. The girl said that of all the species, humans were the worst at using magic powers, but his healing magic was much better than any other elf's. That deserves respect. At the girl's request, Hiram only smiled. He did not yet know what his answer would be, but at that very second, Jorm began jumping on his hind legs with wild eyes, imitating indignation. After a few jumps, the ancient dragon decided to change tactics a little, after which he pretended to fall dead. Jorm tried to tell his king that he should not have taught the hero magic. Hiram leaned over to his ancient dragon, gently took its head in his hands and quietly whispered that this would be quite an interesting activity. The dragon continued to lie silently in his master's arms. After that, Hiram turned around and said that since they had come this far, he was going to be completely honest with Lumiere. He said that she might not even believe what he was about to say. Hiram continued, saying that he was not an ordinary man, but he had indeed fought in many battles, just not in this world. The princess looked at him and did not understand what he was talking about. Then Hiram leaned over, changed his intonation a little, and said that in this world he had only been reborn and now had a human body, but, in fact, he belonged to another race. The guy said that in his world he was a demon, and also the king of demons, if that's the case by the way. He asked the girl if she had ever heard of the Demon King Hiram. Lumiere tensed up a bit. She closed her eyes, a bit scared by the guy's story, and then began shaking her head in different directions, showing denial. She didn't know anything about him or who he was before he was reborn. Jorm sat in Hiram's arms with a displeased expression. The guy petted his dragon a little and said that he was not surprised by this, because what he was talking about happened about 500 years ago. So Hiram, continuing to gently stroke the ancient dragon, decided to sum it up and briefly said that he was a demon, and also their king. He asked the girl if she had changed her mind about training. Then she raised her head and said that among the elves and among the people there are bad and good, as Hiram had told her earlier. Then among the demons there must also be good and evil, she added. Afterwards, she raised her hands, which she lightly clenched, and said that the Demon King was undoubtedly a pro in magic. If he became her teacher, it would be just wonderful for the girl. Hiram stole a glance at the pleased princess. He thought that his words would have a different effect on her, but he observed the exact opposite in her words and emotions. Most likely, because Hiram had previously said that he was the king of his people, the girl decided to observe some secular etiquette, took the edges of her dress and bowed, calling the guy by name. Her face looked very kind and sweet at that moment. The girl decided to repeat and once again asked Hiram to take over her training and tell her the secrets and knowledge in the field of magic. He calmly told her not to call him teacher. After Hiram said that he would teach the girl everything she needed, the princess began to jump for joy and grabbed Hiram's hand, began to thank him, realizing that the guy agreed. Hiram explained that having a human as a princess's teacher could attract a lot of unwanted attention. Hiram didn't want to have to clean it up later, so he didn't want to use labels. She told the girl that a teacher is a teacher, so it would be difficult for her to call him anything else. After a little indignation, she said that then she would call him a Hiram-san. Hiram glanced towards the window. It was already late at night, and bright stars were visible in the sky. The boy had a feeling that someone was watching them, and the king felt it inside. While he was looking out the window, the princess distracted him again by offering the Demon King a bath. She reminded him that he had been on the road and was probably very tired. Hiram agreed, saying that he would do so. Meanwhile, a lone black raven sat on a tree, closely watching what was happening in Princess Lumiere's mansion. After Hiram started to walk away from the window, the raven took one last look, then turned and flew upward. The raven was quite large for an ordinary specimen, as if it were magical. Soon he began to land. As it turned out, the raven was flying in the direction of the mountain where the son of Ermengarde, the ancient fire dragon Yorm, once lived. Another silhouette was visible inside the cave. The figure inside the cave continued to go deeper. Suddenly, its gaze was drawn to a shiny coin lying on the floor. Most likely, it was the remains of the king's treasure. The man looked somewhat like Hiram from his past life. He had horns on his head and began to examine the coin. A raven flew into the cave, headed towards the demon, and began to land on his shoulder. After the raven had settled down, he said something to his master. The demon listened to him intently, and it seemed that he was not very pleased with what he was hearing. And after a few more seconds, during which the raven continued to say something, the demon opened his mouth in surprise, and the coin that was in his hands immediately began to bend in half, under the force of his fingers. The demon who had been examining the cave came to the exit, looked outside, and smiled widely. The coin was already completely crumpled in his hands, and he angrily hissed through his teeth the name of the demon king, Hiram. Hiram sat on the body of the demon god with his wings spread. His eyes glowed with rage, but then something caught his attention. He heard a noise that was getting louder and louder. After Hiram turned around, he saw a girl running towards him. It was the same demoness called Philphy. Hiram was delighted to see her and began to shout to the girl, calling her. A few seconds later, Philphy continued to run towards the demon king, but something suddenly wounded the girl in the back. Hiram immediately jumped down, rushing to help the demoness. He was very worried and was already starting to get angry, calculating with his eyes who dared to do this. She screamed pitifully, and the demon god loomed over her. Opening his chest armor, the demon god began to devour the little girl. Hiram screamed at her, trying to reach out, but she was already inside, sinking deeper. Hiram screamed, still pulling his hand forward. He woke up and found himself on a bed in Princess Ortnail's mansion. Hiram was still dazed for a moment, his heart pounding. Sweat ran through the demon king's body. He was very scared and then grabbed his head, realizing that it was just a bad dream. Behind him on the bed, Yorm was sleeping peacefully, snoring into the blanket. Hiram then began to climb out of bed, sitting on the edge of it. He kept remembering how he tried to save Philphy, but her attempts were unsuccessful. He had not had nightmares for a long time. Then he heard women screaming from the street. Hiram went to the window and saw Princess Lumiere practicing with a wooden sword, swinging it in different directions and refining her movements. When Hiram got up from his bed, he went to his clothes. The boy called out to Jorm, who was still dozing. The dragon woke up, saying that elves are really masters at making beds. Hiram put on his black shirt and said with a grin that they were definitely better at this than dragons. Jorm grimaced and they started walking down the stairs, going into the common kitchen. Meanwhile, the princess had already entered the house, wiping her sweat with a towel after her workout. The girl greeted her guests, saying, "Good morning." Hiram smiled back. Afterwards, the maid invited the guests to join her for breakfast. There were 2 plates of food on the table. Hiram sat down at the table and praised Lumiere for having been working since early morning. At this time, Jorm stood on the table and, grabbing the tablecloth with his hind legs, carefully pulled the food away. The princess asked her guests what they would be doing today, smiling at Hiram. Hiram thought for a moment, picked up his fork of food and said that he had no special plans for today, so he was completely free. The guy thought for a moment and then turned towards the girl. The boy bowed his head slightly, smiled and said that they could practice some magic today if the princess wanted to. The dragon raised his head and opened his eyes wide. Lumiere was overjoyed at the offer, so her response came immediately after the offer. The girl smiled widely and shouted out, saying that she hoped so. Hiram sat down comfortably, leaned back slightly and said that he was not joking. The girl began to shout joyfully and wave her arms, simultaneously saying words of gratitude to her guest demon. After breakfast, they all went to the backyard where the girl had practiced earlier. Hiram looked at the nature around him, then folded his hands and said that magic was divided into 2 types. He decided to start from the beginning and knew further. To a certain extent, the girl could use the magic that her body produces. The princess was surprised by what Hiram was talking about. He then went on to say that this was indeed the case. He recalled one of the incidents and said that otherwise, she would not have been able to fight with her blunt blade against the Orc Lord back on the highway. While Jorm was trying to catch up with the butterflies like a little child, Hiram stood in front of the girl and continued to tell her the basics. Hiram said that at that moment, the girl was using magic. Catching Jorm and holding him in his arms, Hiram said that the only ones who couldn't use magic outside their bodies were those called the powerless. Everything couldn't be taught in one day, so they would start training from the basics. Hiram scolded Jorm for his mischief and released him back to Earth, which made the dragon sad. The boy said that the princess should have stretched both her hands forward first, and the princess obeyed the king. The guy also stretched both his hands forward and began to concentrate his energy. He told the princess to imagine how magical currents flowed throughout her body, heading to her hands. The girl also straightened her hands, and Hiram continued to say these words, programming the girl to think only about this. It was very important to imagine how the flow of magic was flowing to her palms. Hiram noticed that Lumiere had large reserves of magic, and the girl's control was also at a high level. However, in order to master the complex magic inherent to the hero, it was necessary to continue to study the basics. This was the shortest path, thanks to which it was possible to reveal one's potential and safely use the magic of the High Elves. An hour later, the girl's hands were already shaking. Hiram stood with his eyes closed, but when he heard the princess breathing harder, he decided to watch her. Afterwards, the spasm spread to her entire body, and it was clear that she was having a hard time with her lessons. After the girl had almost no strength left, Hiram lowered his hands and said that they were done for today. He praised the princess and she immediately fell to the ground, leaning on her hands. Hiram walked over to a bench nearby and picked up a small towel, which he quickly returned to Lumiere with. He told her that she needed to train every day in her free time. The princess continued to sweat. She reached out and took the towel that Hiram handed her. The girl smiled and said that she understood everything, so she would be more diligent. Since they had time, and the sun was still very high above their heads, the guy suggested that the girl take a walk around the city. He was interested in how people were living there and what people were doing there. The girl was initially a little surprised by what Hiram had suggested. She looked at him for a moment, thinking, and next to her crawled Jorm, who was waiting to hear some kind of reaction. Afterwards, the princess said that if Hiram really wanted it, she would show him the city completely. She could give him a tour of the city, which would help her guests adapt better. Hiram thanked the girl, and then said that Lumiere was a princess and that they would most likely stand out too much in a crowd together. But the princess objected, saying that she could disguise herself. After this conversation, Hiram agreed and Lumiere went inside to pick out some suitable clothes. The Demon King and Yorm stayed outside and began to wait for the girl. After some time, Hiram and Yorm finally heard the voice of the girl who came out of the mansion. The guests turned around and saw a completely new appearance of the princess, which was completely unusual for them. The girl apologized for keeping her guests waiting. She had really disguised herself well. She had fox ears and a tail. Her clothes were like those of an ordinary city dweller. Hiram approached the girl and asked if this was really her disguise, to which the girl immediately responded positively. She said that no one would recognize her in this outfit, but Jorm said that it was obvious from a mile away. The girl decided that the beastman's outfit was very simple, so she should not be recognized. As they moved, the girl told Hiram to call her Lumi. She thought it was a great idea, because if Hiram had addressed her by her real name, they would have been exposed right away. He smiled and said that he agreed with her. The city was very beautifully laid out. It was pretty clean everywhere, and the street was decorated with a bunch of different vintage lanterns. The architecture was also excellent, and there were flags on the roofs of the houses. While Hiram and Jorm were exploring the surroundings and the goods that the local merchants were offering, a little girl ran up to Lumiere and called out to her princess. The girl said that she was hiding her condition, so she needed to be quiet. Hiram was enjoying the local scenery. He approached the princess, who was standing at the counter with Jorm, and said that in his opinion, the elves ruled very beautiful cities. The girl, picking up the baked goods, replied that only wealthy citizens lived in the area, but she was not going to go further. Taking the basket in which the girl was picking up the products, she moved on. Jorm and Hiram could not understand where the princess was going, so they silently followed forward. The girl walked towards the outskirts of the city, close to the place where the main gate was located. The view around them was completely different. This area was very different from the one with the many stalls and statues. People were actually poorer here. The little children immediately swarmed around the princess, calling her Sister Lumi. The girl began to hand out buns that she had bought from the merchants and asked how they were doing. The children also looked with interest at the man with whom the girl had come. They continued jumping around and eating delicious buns. Hiram looked at the children for a long time. Then his gaze was drawn to a boy whose arm was bandaged, probably broken. He leaned over to the child and said that he could heal his arm with magic if he would stand still. Then Hiram said the word healing as he held his hand near the boy's. A flash of light began to shine and the bandages gradually began to loosen, falling off the child's now healthy hand. The children were delighted with what they saw. They began to jump around and rejoice with joy. Someone shouted that it was great to meet a healer, because they had never seen real magic before. While the others were having fun, one of the boys stood behind Hiram and looked at the dragon that was on his back. He called the dragon cute, which brought back memories for Hiram. Once upon a time, little Philphy had looked at him with the same eyes. She had held a small dragon hatchling in the same way and brought it to Hiram, wanting to show him this beauty. The girl rejoiced and said that the little dragon was very cute. This was Jormungandr's baby when he was just born. The elder dragon was also touched by this picture then. Hiram smiled and petted the boy, who reminded him of Philphy. Meanwhile, several more children ran up to Hiram and began to examine the dragon. After that, Jorm flew up, flapping his wings. The children were absolutely delighted and continued to look at the little dragon. Jorm was pleased with how they stared at him with admiration. The children gradually grew in number. After eating their fill, they began to play with Hiram and Princess Lumiere. Hiram was truly happy at that moment and did not hide his emotions. When the children had wandered off a bit, Hiram and the princess sat down on a stone fountain and decided to have a snack too. The girl said that Hiram was very kind to children and she saw it right away. Jorm, however, had the children's full attention at the time. Since the dragon was very young, he seemed to catch the wave and began to play with the others, flying from side to side. Hiram continued chewing and then raised his head and said that this kindness was probably connected somehow with the fact that he saw Philphy in them. The girl asked again because she had not heard anything about her before. Hiram sighed heavily and said that Philphy was the girl he raised when he was the demon lord. Then he said that when the king died, she was 10 years old at the time. The girl was moved by the story about the little demoness. She asked the demon king if he was worried about her now, to which Hiram began to nod approvingly, without saying a word. After a short pause, he said that 500 years had passed since then. She was definitely alive, because he had found out with the help of a magical instrument. In 500 years, she should have grown very strong. Hiram, after another short pause, raised his head and said that he would like to meet her again at least once in this life. He was interested in how she was living now. At this point, they were interrupted by a woman who had been coming closer to them while they were sitting. The woman said that she thanked Sister Lumi for helping her once again. The woman came closer and bowed her head. Lumiere asked about a certain gentleman, and the woman said that he was feeling much better now than before, after which she thanked her again. The next moment, an older man approached them and asked Lumi to listen to him. The girl clasped her hands and said that she was showing the city to Hiram now, so she couldn't do that. Hiram smiled and said that she shouldn't worry about it. In his opinion, it was also part of his excursion, so the princess could listen to what people around her were saying. While Lumiere stood and exchanged news with the people, Hiram moved aside and sat down in a corner. At that moment, Yorm rushed towards him, calling out to his king. The dragon flew up to Hiram and said that the girl was, of course, a great girl, that she listened to everyone's problems, but he didn't think that she had enough strength to solve all these problems. Hiram looked at the crowd that had gathered around the princess and said that it was unlikely that she would be able to sort this all out. Jorm said that people were asking for advice in the hope that everything would be resolved. Two elderly men sat next to each other and talked. One of them said that the princess listened even to such lost people as them. The second emphasized that this made her a beautiful girl. Hiram became curious and decided to join the men's conversation. He asked them if he could find out something, to which the elder replied that the guy could ask whatever he wanted. Hiram wanted to know about the princess, and the old man said that she even came to the slums to listen to the locals. She passed on their words to the Lord and found out if anything could be done about it. The man noted that if they had addressed the Lord directly, he would not have even listened to them, and might even have imprisoned those who had come to him. Then Hiram said that he wanted to know about the Lord. The men said that things were bad with the Lord. He was a former administrative official who had bribed the chancellor of his time, thereby becoming a lord. After a short pause, one of the men pointed a finger at the young man. He addressed the boy, saying that he recognized Hiram. The Demon King was shocked that the men addressed him by name. The old man continued, saying that he knew about Hiram's power. He asked to keep an eye on the princess, because her every move was constantly watched by the Lord's men, and she was in a difficult situation. Hiram didn't understand what was wrong with this lord, and why the princess's situation was difficult. The boy asked the men to tell him more about what was going on here. The man from the slums began to tell about how the chancellor's daughter had married the king and given birth to a little prince. Then the chancellor, apparently, wanted to put him on the throne no matter what. And all this could be prevented by the princess, who enjoyed wide popularity among both aristocrats and common people. In other words, everyone loved her very much. In order to weaken the princess's influence, the chancellor struck at her knights, who at that time were providing her with very strong support in the capital. And then the lord exiled the girl here. The chancellor's faction held all the power at the royal court, and his majesty was nothing more than a puppet, as he was already quite old. The lord was good at pushing him around. Hiram thought about it at that moment. He understood that Lumiel had no allies at the moment, neither in the court itself nor among the knights. The girl was completely alone and surrounded by enemies. The old man said that despite all this, the girl continued to smile and do everything she could for ordinary people, and everyone in the city was grateful to her, they were sure of it. When they had finished their story, they both bowed to Hiram and asked him to watch over the girl and protect her from evil people and elves who could harm her. Hiram bowed his head in response, smiled, and said that he would try to do everything in his power. The men were pleased with the answer they heard, and one of them extended his hand to Hiram. Hiram accepted the gesture and took the old man's hand. After that, the man said that the girl had no strong allies at all and the princess was certainly needed in this. They thanked the young man. The next day, Lumiere trained again in the morning with Hiram, practicing magic. Hiram was surprised at how quickly she was progressing. She was already able to concentrate energy. The girl was happy with the progress, and that she was doing well. It was a sure sign that they were going in the right direction. The princess raised her hands and began to inhale the air greedily. Hiram turned to the maid who was walking towards them carrying a tray of cool drinks. He thought that this was to be expected from the heroine, for her powers were growing at an abnormal rate. The maid unclasped everyone's glasses, and Hiram stopped the training. The girl thanked the maid, and Jorma also got a glass of drink, which he immediately began to greedily lap up. Throwing back his glass, Jorm continued to sip the lemonade, and after he had drained half of it, he threw back his head and cried out that this drink was truly delicious. The girl, who heard all this, immediately turned to the dragon. Hiram came closer and explained that Yorm was actually an ancient dragon that she had to kill back then. Hiram told him to keep quiet because he thought a talking dragon might scare the locals. The girl was amazed that the ancient dragon turned out to be Hiram's creature. She could not believe that the demon could tame this huge beast that lived on the mountain. Hiram smiled, looking away. He confirmed the princess's words, saying that he hoped that knowing this, the princess would not turn away from the dragon and would keep an eye on him too. The girl took the little dragon in her arms and said that, of course, she would be happy to take care of him. The princess began to stroke the dragon, telling him that she was glad to meet him. The dragon dodged aside, rolling his eyes, and sarcastically said that he was also very pleased. But it was good that the princess did not pay attention to this and continued as if nothing had happened. When everyone had a snack after training, Hiram said that he would go and walk around the city a little more with his dragon. The girl came out to see them off and then waved to the guests. Walking a few meters further, Hiram saw that several wealthy citizens had gathered on the street, standing and watching something. From behind them, noise could be heard. Hiram immediately sped towards the crowd of people, pushing everyone else aside. He wanted to find out what was going on and soon saw two children lying on the ground, whining in pain. One of the children said that they had come simply to ask for their message to be conveyed to Princess Lumiere. But the guards were very hostile and chased the children away from the rich district. One of the guards swung his leg and told them to get out of the way. He also called the children too persistent and then added that they belonged to a dirty, inferior race. Hiram didn't bother to find out the details of what was happening any further and jumped up and rushed into the conflict. He kicked one of the guards as his body immediately swept away the second man in armor. The Demon King didn't bother to pick up his strength, so he took a good aim. The knights' bodies flew a couple of meters and stopped, crashing into the wall. Then Hiram turned to the children to see how they were. The kid looked at Hiram with wide eyes and said that the guy was very strong, but Hiram objected, said that it was just that the security was very weak. Then the guy began to find out what happened. The children immediately began to scream, saying that monsters had appeared on the outskirts of the city. They were getting deeper into the city and the road was blocked. People could not escape because they were being held back. Afterwards, Hiram stood up and said that he understood everything. He volunteered to help, saying that he would go there now. The children volunteered to show him the way and they all rushed towards the incident. A huge orc was moving towards the city, destroying houses of peaceful residents and killing people on its way. Everyone was in a panic and ran towards the city gates to escape from it. But the iron gate was closed, and a frightened crowd had already gathered around it. While everything behind them was gradually collapsing and the orcs were becoming more numerous, the people continued to shout, demanding that the grate be opened. One man said that otherwise they would all be eaten, but the guards ignored their requests. One of the guards said that if they opened the gates, the monsters would also enter the city. There was a lord in the city who confirmed that the gates should not be opened, saying that these people were a dirty race. The people continued to look at the lord pitifully, begging him to spare at least the children's lives. But all attempts were a waste of time, and it seemed that the elves had gathered at the gates to watch the massacre. The gentleman who stood with the staff shouted that the lives of elves were much more valuable than the lives of some humans. Meanwhile, behind him, the noise of a fight and the clink of armor could be heard. When this caught his attention and he turned, he saw one of the injured guards lying at his feet trying to mumble something. The man's voice addressed the lord. It was Hiram. He killed several guards to get to the lord. The Demon King said that if he was not going to protect people, then he should give up his powers. After this, after a short pause, Hiram hit one of the guards who was pulling him by the leg and added that this lord should follow Lumiel's example in the manner of communicating with the people. The knights went wild after these words. One of the guards shouted, indignant at how anyone dared open their filthy mouth to their master. They called on him to prepare for death. As soon as the guards began to approach, they also surrounded Hiram. But with literally one powerful blow to the ground, he created a wave that immediately threw back the guards running at him. After Hiram had dealt with most of the party, he cast his gaze towards the lord. He rushed forward, wanting to teach the lord some manners, when the lord shouted that the stranger was presuming too much less making fun of him. Then the lord took his staff, which gradually began to glow, and began to raise it higher towards him. Magical energy gathered around, and the lord himself shouted that Hiram deserved to die. After the huge gouts of fire had been collected at the top, which all happened quite quickly, the lord pointed his staff towards Hiram and shouted for him to die. The ball flew towards the young man and resembled the attack of the dragon that Hiram had already encountered in the cave when he fought Yorm. The explosion thundered, lifting the stone slab from the roads. But Hiram remained unharmed. He was doing a great job of holding back the magical onslaught, repelling the spell. Hiram's defensive magic was at its highest level. After he managed to contain this fiery magical flow, Hiram gradually began to clench his hand into a fist, as if absorbing it, and indeed, the ball began to shrink and drown in the young man's hand. As the dust that had risen began to clear and all the onlookers gathered to see what was left of the guy who had contradicted the Lord, Hiram suddenly jumped out of the darkness, reaching out his hand to the Lord's neck. Hiram grabbed the Lord by the neck and lifted him off the ground. The Demon King told him that if he could cast spells, he would be able to fight in that case. Raising his head a little more, Hiram added that together with the knights, their strength would be enough even for the Orc Lord. The Lord began to try to break free from Hiram's hands, but it was too late. Then the Lord cried out, saying that Hiram, apparently, was very stupid, because he did not understand why he, the Lord of the Elves, should go and fight for an inferior race. Hiram only sighed heavily. After hearing the words, he said that the Lord was just a stubborn ram with an inflated self-esteem. He threw him far into the air with one hand, wanting to show what happens to such people. The Lord was gripped by fear. He was in complete weightlessness and flew over the city gates, moving towards the attacking monsters. The Lord screamed for a long time and soon landed. He fell to the hard ground with great speed, but it was not enough to kill the high elf, and when he began to rise, he saw a huge orc bearing down on him. After Hiram had thrown him aside, he turned to the guards. While they were looking at each other in some kind of commotion, Hiram asked them if they would help their master, for whom they were shouting so much here. The knights stood there, trembling slightly, but did not show their fear. One of them ordered Hiram to shut up, but no one rushed to help the Lord, who was already behind the wall. Hiram looked at them, sighed, and said that he had not expected anything else. He said that he would go himself then, but in that case the guards should not forget to thank him for the work he had done. Footsteps were heard not far from Hiram, who was talking to the guards. It was Lumiel. The girl walked with her sword at the ready and said that she too would go fight the monsters beyond the wall. Hiram and Princess Lumiel headed towards the gate. As the girl passed the guards, who heard such words in her direction, the incompetent princess came onto the stage. The guards reproached her for the fact that such an incompetent princess gets along with equally incompetent people, considering it funny. The princess was very angry about this, but she pulled herself together and walked on, ignoring it. As they moved towards the closed gates, behind which crowds of people were still standing and shouting for help, no one interfered or hindered them. Hiram walked up to the bars, turned to the princess, and smiled shyly at her. The next moment, the Demon King squeezed the bars and began to tear the bars completely out of the fastenings that were in the wall. The way was cleared and Hiram and Princess Lumiere came out to the people. People poured in, smiling and thanking the guys for helping them. The princess asked if there was anyone left. One of the boys who had managed to get into the city waved his hand and said that there was no need to worry anymore. Everyone who needed to be saved was already here and was entering the city. Continuing to move alongside, Princess Lumiere said that in that case, everything was fine and in the future they could rely on them and Hiram. The girl promised to deal with the monsters. Turning around, Hiram began to rummage through his magic bag and after a while he pulled out the same sword that he had given to the princess earlier. He handed the blade to the girl. Princess Lumiere thanked Hiram and headed towards the Orc Lord first. Hiram stayed behind, leaving Lumiere to deal with the giant on her own, something she had failed to do last time. The girl confidently continued to walk towards the Orc Lord, and soon he noticed that people were walking towards him. He turned and with a languid look assessed the size of his opponent with a sword in his hands. Deciding to scare the hero who was approaching him, the Orc Lord's face suddenly changed and he furiously hit the building that was next to him. The house shattered into several small pieces. Then, raising his huge hand up, preparing it for an attack, the orc ran towards Lumiel, but the girl headed towards him, confidently holding Hiram's blade in her hands. This orc leader was much larger than the one they had met on the highway. This was a serious test for Lumiel. The orc hit the ground, but she managed to jump aside. Despite the orc's size, he was quite fast and obviously very strong. Lumiere tried to get closer to him to strike, but he began to swing his arms faster. The Orc Lord decided that he would hardly be able to hit such a small target as this elf, so he began to pound the ground, scattering stones and pieces of earth everywhere. This whole pile of debris began to rise up and fly towards Lumiere, but the girl was quite agile, so she managed to dodge the stones flying at her. She dodged for quite a while, but it only took her further away from the goal the girl was heading for. She landed on her feet, leaning on one knee and sighed heavily. Then she concentrated and closed her eyes, still holding the sword in front of her. The girl was going to use the weapon she had been training with for the last few days, along with Hiram. The girl held the blade and continued to imagine how magic flowed throughout her body and went in the direction of her hands. Since she had already achieved good progress in the basics, it became much faster. The stones continued to fall nearby, and the orc gradually moved towards the girl. She was already ready to rise, and the magic that the girl was concentrating was already flowing in thin charges nearby. The princess continued to sit in place, and the orc lord came closer and closer. He ran, waving his arms, and was ready to crush the girl with one blow, raising her to the ground. The orc swung and hit exactly where Lumiere was sitting, but literally at the last second, when the blow was already a few centimeters from her face, the princess was able to react. She jumped to the side, going behind the huge orc's back, which was now left unprotected. The orc lord had put a lot of effort into this blow, so he couldn't quickly return his hands to their place and continue. Lumiere raised her blade and started on the huge monster's limbs. She slid past the orc's legs and dealt him several painful wounds, cutting through almost the entire area. The girl was not going to stop and continued to wield her sword. It was clear that now every movement of hers was accompanied by magic emanating from her body. After the orc's legs were damaged, he could no longer stand on them, so his huge body began to fall to the ground. He bent down on one knee, and the princess prepared to jump. As her target became slightly lower, Lumiere realized that she could now reach out and decapitate the orc lord, ending the fight immediately. With a swing of her blade, the outcome was sealed. The head of the orc lord did not immediately separate from his body and began to fly to the ground. Lumiere gradually came out of her battle trance, and the magic that was inside her began to subside. Landing, the girl closed her eyes for a moment. She needed to take it all in, because she really was much better this time and much stronger. It was still hard for her to get used to all this, because today was the first time she had used magic in a fight and won. Soon she opened her eyes again and saw Hiram walking towards her. The princess rose to her feet. The orc lord's body was already lying on the ground, and Lumiere began waving her hand, shouting that she had succeeded. The girl was incredibly happy about this, because all her efforts were not in vain. Hiram saw exactly how the princess fought. He was pleased with this and raised his hand and began to rub his chin. Hiram told the princess that she really had become much stronger. Lumiere continued running towards him with a big smile on her face. She had no intention of holding back her emotions, and later said that she had become stronger precisely because Hiram became her teacher. People were also watching the battle that was taking place not far from the gate. When the orc lord fell to the ground, children ran joyfully shouting and celebrating the princess's victory. Hiram felt something and knew that there was probably something else that could appear now. He stopped the running children with his hand and told them to go back. He turned around and said with a grim face that it was not over yet, so it was still not safe here. Jorm, who had gotten off his shoulder, began waving his paws at the children to run back to the city. Suddenly the earth shook and some dark magical portal began to open above the orc lord's body. It was all black and various symbols were hovering in circles. It happened literally a few meters from the guys. When Hiram saw all this, he immediately pointed his hand to the side and ordered them to run. The portal was getting bigger. The princess asked Hiram what it was, but he just kept looking up. Soon, a monster that was not completely covered in flesh began to crawl out of the portal. It was a dragon. The black portal gradually rose upward, and the dragon continued to crawl out of it. And finally, the tail flashed and the beast found itself on the ground. It looked terribly scary. The dragon crashed to the ground, kicking up dust and sand in a circle, and finally destroying those houses and lands that the orc lord had not dealt with. Hiram and Lumiere stood nearby. Hiram looked at the monster carefully and said with a little surprise that it was an adult zombie dragon. The princess was shocked by what she heard. She could not believe that it was a zombie. Hiram began to explain to the girl that despite the fact that this dragon was dead, its soul was attached to the corpse. In other words, it was a dragon that someone turned into undead after death. Hiram really couldn't figure out where he came from. The Demon King even bowed his head to Yoram and asked the dragon if he knew this dragon. Yoram just shook his head, denying it. Then Hiram raised his head again and looked at the princess. She was a little taken aback, but quite prepared, which the guy immediately noticed. Hiram asked the girl if she could handle it, to which she answered hesitantly, yes. Lumiere turned to the dragon and looked him up and down. This was the first dragon she had gotten so close to. She had wanted to banish the dragon earlier, but it was unclear what to expect from a zombie. Afterwards, the girl gathered her thoughts. She believed in her strength, as training and controlling the flow of magic gave her confidence. She turned to the dragon and told them to leave it to her. The dragon at this time slightly swayed from side to side and then opened its mouth and began to roar. The sound was deafeningly loud and it demolished everything in its path. Hiram ran towards the children who had run outside the city walls. The dragon stood on its hind legs, increasing its roar. The buildings around it began to collapse and Lumiere rushed to attack. After Hiram got to the children, he stood in front of them like a wall and told them not to come out from behind him because they could be in danger. The children covered their ears, trying to endure it. Meanwhile, Lumiere, who had managed to move forward to meet the dragon, bounced off the ground on her small heel and dealt the dragon the first blow in the area of its long neck. Blood gushed from the dragon's wound, but the blow was far from fatal, so their battle continued. He swung his paw towards Lumiere, driving the princess away from him. Lumiere was much faster and more agile than the huge dragon, and managed to dodge its attacks, getting closer and closer to the beast's head. The dragon began to pick up the pace, accelerating its movements. But the princess continued to cope, and at one point she dodged the attack with a jump and then climbed onto the dragon itself. The girl's goal was the head, so there was no time to hesitate. When Lumiere was already running along one wing of the dragon and was a few meters from the neck, the monster turned to her and a fiery flash was visible from its mouth. The dragon was preparing to strike with its breath. Fire gushed out of the dragon's mouth and headed towards the girl. Lumiere could never escape from it, no matter how much she wanted to, so there was only one option. A powerful stream of fire gushed onto the ground and swallowed the girl. The ground around her began to crumble, and through the rare gaps in the stream, one could see the silhouette of the princess, who was still standing on her feet. Everyone was surprised by what happened. The children started screaming in panic, thinking that this was the end. Hiram and Jorm also watched in surprise at everything that was happening. But the girl managed to hold back the onslaught of fire by holding her sword in front of her. She was completely unharmed and soon swung her sword, creating space for herself to see the enemy. The next moment, Princess Lumiel jumped up and pointed towards the dragon's mouth. When the dragon spat fire at the girl, he made the mistake of getting close to where she was standing. Breaking free of the flames, Lumiere flew towards the dragon's head, and with a powerful swing of the sword that Hiram gave her, the girl struck, separating part of the lower jaw from the dragon's head. When she finished her attack, she immediately landed on the ground, continuing to watch the dragon's further actions. The beast was furious and, bleeding, directed its gaze towards the elf. Lumiel wasn't going to stop there and, sensing blood, she moved on to attack. The dragon began to summon his fiery breath again, hoping to incinerate the princess to the ground. When Hiram saw that the girl had not been harmed by the stream of fire, he began to explain to the children that if a warrior could cut the dragon's breath, then its roar was not at all scary for him. Just after the fire attack, the beast once again began its menacing roar. But the girl continued to circle around her huge opponent, inflicting more and more wounds on him. Hiram also said that the dragon's strong scales were like paper for the hero, which is why it was so easy for her to wound him. Hiram continued to sit and added that it was not surprising that the girl was called the natural enemy of dragons. He practically did not have to do anything, and Jorm added that this was why he did not like heroes. Continuing to circle, at some point the dragon caught the girl and with a blow of its tail sent her towards the city houses. The blow was sharp, so the girl was thrown back a fairly decent distance. The girl's body rushed towards one of the roofs and then collided with it. The building's tiles began to fly apart, and the frightened children screamed again, showing their emotions. When the dragon thought he had neutralized the princess, his eyes were drawn to the children who were already running towards Hiram. The beast began to turn and prepare to attack. The princess was fully conscious and began to rise to her feet. When she saw that the dragon was no longer interested in her, she watched where he went. One of the girls, who was running away, fell, tripping on one of the rubble of the houses. The shadow of the beast immediately loomed over them, and the princess only managed to shout for them to run away. At that moment, the dragon directed its fiery breath towards the peaceful inhabitants of the city, or rather, the fleeing children. The children covered themselves, thinking that the end had come for them, and soon the flames caught up with them. But before it could do any damage, the flames ran into a magical shield covered in various demonic symbols. The flames went around it and were unable to pass through this barrier. The girl did not see this shield and, having extended her hand, she already said goodbye to the children who had been hit. But Hiram controlled everything and managed to create a defense that left everyone unharmed. Without much effort, Hiram created a magical barrier that once helped him in the fight with the young Yoram. The children looked at him as if he were a superhero, and the boy smiled at them, stroking their heads. With the danger gone and the children safe, it was time to stop the destruction the dragon had brought. Hiram turned towards him and cast his magic again. From the flames that the dragon was belching out, chains began to appear and began to throw themselves at the huge zombie dragon, shackle it. The beast tried to resist, but it was useless. Soon the chains, along with the flames, began to completely wrap around the dragon, binding its wings, neck, and entire body. The monster roared, trying to break them, waving its limbs. Afterwards, Hiram squeezed his hand, and at that very moment, the chains settled tightly on the body of the fire-breathing dragon. Then the dragon, who was trying to fly, immediately turned over and fell on the ground on its back. The dragon still tried to resist for some time and did not stop trying to break free, but the Demon King's magic was much stronger than this huge creature. In full control, Hiram turned and shouted the princess's name. He wanted her to be the one to deliver the final blow, to put an end to this. Lumiere was already running toward him. The girl quickly closed the distance to her target, and when there were only a few meters left, she jumped off the ground and rushed towards the monster's neck, which was only half covered in flesh. As she raised her sword, it was clear that the girl had once again used magic in battle, which had obviously made her stronger. Her gaze was full of determination, and she was going to end it all right now. Reaching the dragon's body, Lumiere plunged her blade, piercing the dragon's scales, which began to fall down in small grains at the cut. Moving further, she widened the cut. Having circled the dragon's neck with blades in its body, at the very end, Lumiere screamed and made every effort to decapitate this monster, which she successfully did. After that, the princess landed on the ground and immediately found support in her blade. Using magic in battle was much more tiring, but despite all this, the girl was now on a completely different level. The princess, greedily gulping air, could not catch her breath when she heard words of gratitude from behind. It was the dragon whose soul she had freed, defeating his physical form. And so the dragon was defeated. He lay on the ground and continued to bleed, not uttering another word. Lumiere rose to her feet and turned to his body. The girl bowed her head and wished the soul of the ancient beast to rest in peace. It was very strange that the dragon thanked her when she was still a hero, their sworn enemy. While the princess stood there trying to analyze the entire battle, she heard slow footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw Hiram with Yoram. The Demon King said that the girl was excellent. Lumiere smiled as she expressed her gratitude to her teacher. She knew very well that if it weren't for her practice with magic, she would never have been able to defeat such a beast. As Hiram and Lumiere exchanged a few pleasant words and glances, their solitude was interrupted by joyful children who ran out to embrace their princess who had saved them. They also did not ignore the merits of Hiram, who helped the princess and protected them with a magical shield, saving them from certain death. Hiram smiled again and stroked one of the boys. The Demon King said that the children don't have to worry about him. If anyone was worth thanking in this situation, it was the princess who showed true heroism and slew the ancient dragon. More and more people came to look at the dragon's body and to see if the princess was okay. Lumiere was more concerned about the children, asking if they were all still alive. While Lumiere was receiving congratulations, applause, and thanks, she looked very happy. People already loved her, and now they were simply ready to idolize her. Hiram frowned and started to move away. He understood that all this had happened for a reason and that someone was clearly involved and quite powerful. Jorm flew up to his king, addressing him. Hiram said that this was another trap for Lumiere, and if he had not come, everything could have turned out completely differently. Hiram thought that the girl would probably rush alone after the hero's egg. After she freed herself from the control of the owner of the estate, she would probably go to fight the Orc Lord. And then they prepared a zombie dragon for her, which would decide the outcome. But the way things turned out differently, Hiram knew that her enemy would not like it. Moving forward, they found the Lord who was sitting in the corner. The feudal lord held his head tightly and shook, deeply panicked. Hiram came closer and called out to him, wanting to talk and find out his involvement in the attack. But the lord continued to clutch his head, and his whole body shook with fear. He could not utter a couple of coherent words, continuing to simply mumble something and make different sounds. Jorm looked at the elf and asked his king, assuming that the man had finally gone mad. Hiram said that it was indeed very suspicious. At that moment, the Demon King bent down a little and used magic to see if there was any seal on the Lord or perhaps black magic that would definitely leave its mark. It took Hiram some time, and then he said that he really did have a curse on him, which, however, was very well hidden and not everyone could understand it. Jorm scratched his chin and asked Hiram why anyone would curse the owner of the estate. Hiram said the first thing that came to mind was that his speech was sealed. In addition, Hiram noted that this was not ordinary magic, but one with a special character. This curse was similar to the demon magic that he knew very well. Jorm tried to see and understand for a while, but Hiram turned around and said that it was time for them to go. This lord was useless now, so there was no point in wasting time on him. And so the next day came. The weather was great, so in the morning, as always, Hiram and Lumiere went to practice, and then settled down outside to take a short break. Lumiere moved away somewhere when the maid approached her. Together they went into the house, and after some time the girl was already running happily with some small envelope in her hands. The girl was trying to tell Hiram something in a hurry, who was still sitting at the table. Then she said that His Majesty was inviting the guy to go to the capital. Hiram was apparently not very happy about this news. He thought it was another suspicious move. He asked the girl for what purpose they wanted to see him at court. Lumiere had already approached the table and said that Hiram was wanted to be seen for recognition of his achievements and an award, but the Demon King said that he did not think that he had accomplished anything. Hiram said that it all happened quite quickly, since he had only defeated the dragons yesterday. Lumiere explained that they had a special magical device for instant communication. The young man thought again, because it seemed to him that this was only a formal reason to lure him out. At the same time, he was still interested in what would come out of all this. Hiram said he was not against it, but he had one condition. He said the girl would have to go with him. Hiram did not say that she was in danger and that this was not the first attempt on her life. His Majesty had instructed his daughter to accompany him, so she would be with him in any case. Hiram smiled and said that in that case he agreed to go on the journey. Lumiere was very happy with her guest's positive response, so she smiled again and said that in that case she would go get ready. Hiram thanked the girl and continued drinking tea. As soon as the boy stood up and reached for the sugar, Jorm, who was also sitting and eating, asked his king if he was sure. There were many bad guys in the capital, and Hiram agreed. Taking another sip from his cup, Hiram remembered everything that had happened to them recently. The bandits, the orc lord, and then the zombie dragon. They had definitely set some kind of trap. When he put the cup down, he told Jorm that he wanted to see what was interesting anyway. You could tell from Hiram that he was looking for some kind of adventure. After they had finished their meal, the carriage was already standing nearby, and the maids were carrying the suitcases with the princess's things there. Hiram stood up and told Jorm that it was time for them to go. Somewhere on another continent, it was a dark night. Flocks of dragons flew around the luxurious Gothic houses, circling in the sky. The entire city was dark, from the buildings to its inhabitants. There were many servants in the palace. They were demons, as you could see from their horns. The girl who sat on the throne asked her subject to repeat what he had just told her. An army of officers, consisting of demons, stood around the throne, one knee bent to the ground. The man repeated, said that Hiram was reborn as a man, but the girl did not believe it. It was Queen Irmgard, who sat on her throne, made up of a pile of skulls that belonged to the enemies of the demonic race. She was told that the information was true. Many were very surprised by this, and sighs were heard throughout the hall. One of the men in glasses said that the magic of reincarnation was very complicated, and even Hiram could make a mistake in it. But what made the task more difficult was that he chose the human race for reincarnation. On the one hand, this strongly reflected the king's luck, and on the other, his strength. They of men said that Hiram would cause them many problems. Queen Irmgard understood that the issue had to be resolved somehow. Then one of her subjects came closer to her and again bent his knee. It was the same man with glasses. He paused and said that Hiram would have to be gotten rid of. He came closer because he wanted to take this task upon himself. The man raised his left hand to his chest and began to ask the queen for permission to begin the hunt for Hiram. One of the main arguments this demon put forward was that he was keeping order in the kingdom of Ortville, where Hiram was now. He asked again to entrust this matter to him. The queen stood up and glanced at the man who was kneeling. She said that she agreed to give him this task, but mentioned that the matter was very important and responsible. The man gave a gesture of respect to his queen and thanked her for trusting her subordinate. The queen began to turn back to her throne. But before she could do it completely, Queen Irmgard shouted that the man had to bring her Hiram's head to prove his death. The subject agreed with her and said that he would do everything. After the reception was over, everyone began to leave. The queen headed towards one of the balconies, the path to which was covered with many cages with various monsters and creatures. She wondered how Hiram could have been reborn. They believed that the divine retribution spell completely erased the demon essence from this planet, but it could be because of the race change. The queen continued to think about it as she stepped out onto the balcony. She understood that the human race was quite strong if it contained the soul of another race, but such cases had been rare before. The balcony railing cracked in her hands with anger. She was furious when she learned that Hiram was still alive. She knew he would return to take his throne back. A black aura enveloped Queen Irmgard. She screamed that Hiram was very weak and unworthy of being in her place. From now on, when he changed his race, he could no longer lead all the demons of the continent. After the demon received his order, he did not hesitate to avoid angering his queen and immediately set out to search the kingdom of Ortvale in order to find Hiram in human form. Hiram, accompanied by Princess Lumiere and several of her servants, made a short halt at night so that everyone could recuperate. They set up a small camp and lit a fire. It was late at night and everyone was already asleep. Jorm curled up, settling down very close to the fire. A bright flash that appeared in it illuminated the travelers' camp with light. At that moment, Princess Lumiere woke up. She began to rise from her sleeping place, continuing to look sleepily at the sky. She saw rays and a bright light that illuminated a significant part of the forest nearby. As it turned out, the source of the bright light was Hiram himself, who was awake. He used magic on the necklace that Philphy was wearing. Hiram wanted to know where his little demoness was. Trying to control the flow of energy, Hiram directed it at the stone, which from time to time flickered with a green light. It was this stone that contained all the magical essence in the object. After several attempts, Hiram gave up and grabbed the necklace that had fallen into his hand, clearly displeased with his inability to locate the girl. Suddenly he heard something making noise nearby. Hiram turned sharply towards the sound and saw someone making his way through the trees and bushes towards him. It was a familiar person. He smiled and saw Princess Lumiere coming towards him. Hiram put on the necklace and apologized to the princess, thinking that he might have woken her up. The girl said that everything was fine and wanted to know what he was doing there. Hiram pointed to the necklace that was already hanging on his gae and said that he was trying to find Philphy again. The Demon King had been standing there for a couple of hours, hoping that he would succeed. The princess was surprised, and with her mouth wide open she clapped her hands. The girl was curious how the successes were carried out, because she remembered how Hiram told about Philphy before. They headed back towards the camp. Hiram said that he hadn't gotten any results, but it wasn't as simple as it seemed. The princess tried to cheer him up. Lumiere told Hiram not to give up and that he would definitely meet her. She promised to help in any way she could, for which Hiram thanked her as he approached his bed. Hiram began to pack and said that they would be in the capital by lunchtime tomorrow, so they needed to get a good night's sleep. He urged the princess to go back to bed, wishing her good night. The girl looked at Hiram, who was smiling at her, and then at the little dragon, Yoram, who was sleeping very nicely, snoring lightly. She smiled and began to lay down too. Before the girl closed her eyes, she also wished Hiram good night, and then for some time she thought about how they would appear together at the royal palace tomorrow. The very next day, their carriage was already approaching the main gates. The capital was much larger than the previous city and very beautiful. The castle tower reached to the sky. As their carriage passed through the local streets, Yoram leaned out the window and looked at the local beauty full of admiration. It was worth remembering that the ancient dragons were very fond of aesthetic beauty and luxury. But in addition to the many different beauties of the city, the dragon's attention was also drawn to the various delicacies and desserts that were displayed in almost every window of the house. Throughout the city there were various huge statues of elves, flags on the spires, and noble houses. The city had heavy traffic and some people also moved around in carriages. Passing another house, the princess loudly exclaimed that her little sister lived in one of the houses. She immediately invited her guests to pay her a visit, because the princess had not seen her for a long time. Hiram smiled and said that he saw no problem with that and they would be happy to join in, accompanying the princess. Jorm was clearly unhappy with this and began to sigh loudly. Princess Lumiere thanked Hiram and said that she was more than sure that her sister would be very happy about Lumiere's visit. The carriage turned into one of the small streets and soon they were there. After driving for a few more minutes, leaving the main road that led to the palace, the carriage passed white clean paving stones and soon a luxurious and wonderful garden appeared ahead. The carriage stopped at one of the palaces and the carrier said that they had arrived. Lumiere immediately hurried outside, expecting to see her little sister as soon as possible. When they were already outside, Hiram began to examine the entire mansion. He asked if it was Lumiere's legacy, to which the princess replied that no, because only her sister lived there. The doors of the mansion opened, and Hiram and the princess walked in. The Demon King asked the girl why her sister lived separately, to which the princess explained that she was sick and was currently undergoing treatment. Hiram also began to examine everything inside. The house looked very luxurious, as befits a royal family. He also noticed the servants who lined up in a row. The guy said that they all looked pretty prepared and then started asking if they were all from the kingdom or not. The princess confirmed this guess, saying that they were being prepared specially. Hiram thought that given the way the servants looked, they probably all knew how to fight, but the princess smiled and said that was not true because not all of them received training in knightly skill. Soon, after passing several rooms and a couple of corridors, one of the servants opened a room from which light was streaming. The princess said that they were there because this was her sister's room. When they entered, they saw a little girl with blonde hair like her sister. The girl rose slightly from the bed, immediately turning her head towards the guests. The little lady was very happy about her sister's visit, and tears immediately began to well up in her eyes. She could not believe that she was seeing her beloved sister in front of her. Lumiere immediately rushed to embrace the little girl, pressing her tightly to her chest. The princess said that it was really her. Lumiere returned home. The girl hugged her younger sister. The girl said that she was very happy to see Lumiere in good health, to which she replied that she was also happy that she was able to meet her. The girl turned her attention to Hiram and Yoram, who had also entered her room. She asked Lumiere who it was. The girl smiled and said that she would now introduce her companions. She turned and said that this was Hiram and Jorm. Then she introduced her younger sister, whose name was Selena. Hiram waved at the girl and smiled sweetly. After that, the girl very slowly began to climb out of bed, gathering her strength. Lumiere was initially worried about this, because she knew that her little sister was very ill. Selena finally crawled out of bed, picked up her dress, and bowed to the guests. She said that she was very pleased to meet new people and also added something else. In addition, she said that she thanked the boys for taking care of her older sister. After clearing her throat a little, the girl looked in amazement at the little dragon that was flying around the room. Hiram introduced his friend, said that Yorm was an ancient dragon. This caused amazement in Selena, and she said that she had heard about them in various legends and fairy tales. It was an honor for her. Jorm did not remain silent and turned to the girl, asking her if she was afraid of him. The dragon struck Selena again because he could speak. The dragon said that he was very strong. Selena smiled and said that she was not afraid to be near Yoram. Afterwards, the dragon flew up and said that if she wanted, she could gently pet him, to which she immediately agreed. The dragon lay down on the bed, bending over to Selena's knees. She began to stroke him and became more and more touched by this wonderful creature. Rarely could anyone see a dragon so close, much less touch it. Hiram and Lumiere stood nearby and smiled, seeing that the little girl was enjoying herself so much. Jormum enjoyed it too and began to cry, completely relaxed. The dragon wagged his tail in different directions, and Selena, continuing to stroke him, raised her head and asked her sister how they managed to meet Hiram. Lumiere, sitting on the bed, hugged her younger sister and said that Hiram once saved her from the robbers who attacked her near the highway where she now lives. Selena raised her hand and shouted that she wanted to know all the details. Then Selena began to tell her about her battle with the Orc Lord and the magical artifacts. Time flew by very quickly. Lumiere and Hiram told many stories that happened to them, as well as various heroic adventures. Soon, when Selena was already completely tired and stopped actively asking the children about mythical creatures and magic, the girl began to gradually fall asleep, so Lumiere covered her with a blanket. Hiram began to pace the room. Lumiere said she had never seen her sister so energetic before. Hiram said he was glad, and now that Selena had some rest, she would probably feel better. The Demon King walked up to the window and began to pull up the curtains. At that moment, the girl said that the doctors had explained to her that it would not be that simple. Hiram, however, said that her illness was indeed almost incurable. But after a bit of walking around the room, the guy said that he was good at such things and saw the reason for Selena's illness. Lumiere couldn't believe what she was hearing and cried out with joy. Hiram, continuing to walk around the room, began to explore the surfaces using magic, and in places where he passed his hand, barely noticeable, small flakes began to fall. Afterwards, the guy turned to Lumiere and said that they had chosen a great room for Selena. Selena smiled and was surprised by Hiram's statement. She said that she thought this room was quite ordinary. The man bowed slightly, placing his hand on his chest, and said that everything was ready for dinner. Lumiere turned around, realizing that it was already so late, because time really flew by very quickly. Yoram yawned loudly and said that he was very tired and also wanted to sleep. The ancient dragon glanced sideways at the bed and said that he would sleep with Princess Lumiere's younger sister. Lumiere turned and asked the ancient dragon about dinner, since they had eaten almost nothing all day except for lunch when they arrived, but the dragon said that it was his nature not to eat. Hiram glanced approvingly at his pet. Hiram came a little closer to his dragon and said that he was relying on Yoram. The dragon happily whispered that he sensed that something was wrong here, so he would keep an eye on little Selena. Then Hiram said that he was also ready to go to dinner, and they left the room, leaving Selena and Yoram in one room. Having gone downstairs, the servants were already finishing serving the dishes. The table was set for just 2 people. There were candles in the middle and a variety of culinary delights. Nothing else could be expected from the table of the royal family. Hiram and Lumiere were given sparkling wine and sat and ate in silence for some time until the princess decided to break the silence. She asked Hiram if he was going to the bathroom today. The Demon King looked closely at the servants standing nearby, almost in close proximity, and then said it would be very good because they had come a long way. When dinner was over, Hiram was given some toiletries and escorted downstairs. The king began to change his clothes and the servants offered to help him, which Hiram immediately refused. Walking inside, there was a large bathtub in the center of the room, filled to the brim with hot water. Hiram immersed himself in it, threw back his head, and relaxed, exhaling heavily upward. The room itself was quite small. In fact, it contained only this large bathtub in the center and nothing else. For Hiram, this was just what he needed because he had long wanted to be alone. He sat with his back to the entrance and soon heard footsteps approaching him. Hiram realized that his privacy had been violated, and then the thought occurred to him that the servant might be the murderer after all. Bracing himself, Hiram listened intently as the footsteps grew closer and closer. The Demon King placed his hand to his head and began to concentrate the flow of magic. He knew he would soon have to fight back, so when the man who entered the room came very close, Hiram suddenly jumped up and pointed his hand towards his uninvited guest. When he turned around completely, he did not expect to see Princess Lumiere there at all. The girl was also frightened by Hiram's unexpected and abrupt movement. Hiram stared at her and said her name timidly, waiting for some kind of explanation. The girl continued to look at the floor for a moment, ashamed to tell the truth. Hiram remained silent and looked at the princess, expecting at least some explanation from her. The Demon King himself already had some guesses, and he roughly understood the reason for the princess's presence here. The guy grabbed Lumiere by the shoulders, not waiting for any answer from her. The girl was very shocked and just watched Hiram, waiting for what he would do. But Hiram, with one deft movement, turned Lumiere back to the door she had come from. He didn't particularly want to see anyone right now, so he wanted to go back to the bath later. Hiram took a few steps back from Lumiere, who continued to stand in place. She turned her head, but Hiram was ahead of her and asked first why she had come here. The thought crept into the guy's mind that if Lumiere had gone this far, then there was something she could tell only in a place where no one else could go except them. Hiram asked her what was wrong. He didn't want to pressure the girl, so he adjusted his tone, regardless of where she found him. The guy told her to tell her about her problems. Lumiere bowed her head and said that she had come about Selena. She had one request. Hiram, without turning around, asked what she wanted to know. The girl did not know what would happen to her sister because it was not yet clear. She said that if her Lumiere suddenly disappeared and something happened to her, then little Selena would have no one to rely on. She timidly turned her head towards Hiram, who was standing behind her, and asked that in that case the gentleman become a support for the little sister of the Princess Lumiere. Hiram exhaled and said that the girl could rely on him completely. As mentioned earlier, he already understood that something was wrong in this house. But he hadn't said anything about it to the princess yet, so as not to frighten her in advance, especially since she could screw things up and scare off those who wished them harm. The girl looked at Hiram. Tears began to appear in her eyes, and she asked if Hiram would protect her sister, to which the Demon King responded approvingly, saying that he would protect the sister of Princess Autreveil. Hiram continued to stand with his back to Lumiere, and the girl, having already turned around by that time, hugged the Demon King from behind. She said that she was very grateful to him for everything he did for her. An hour later, Hiram emerged from the bath, feeling rested and refreshed. He spent some time alone, thinking about everything that had happened. It was now clear to him why Lumiere did not trust even her father and why she had such high hopes for him. Hanging a towel around his neck, Hiram headed for the exit, realizing the gravity of the situation. Approaching the place where he had left his clothes, Hiram met a servant who, bowing his head, handed him clean linen. The servant asked how the time in the bathroom had been. Hiram understood that he was constantly being watched. The courtier offered him a drink, and Hiram, without refusing, handed him a glass. After Hiram had rested a little, the second servant said that he would take his master to his room. They began to move along the corridor and soon came to one of the doors. Hiram pushed open the thick wooden door and stepped inside to find that the room was very simple and small. The windows were barred and the floor and walls were bare stone. Hiram thought at that moment that this room reminded him of some prison. He stood for a while and looked around, as at that moment the servant who had seen him off had already come out and wished him good night. The young man thought that Selena was definitely not safe here. Most likely, this building really was intended for criminals. Even the layout of the estate itself spoke of this. But there was no reason to complain. All in all, Hiram had not had such a bad evening, having had a wonderful dinner and a huge hot bath. He fell on the bed and began to yawn loudly. After lying there for a while, Hiram felt his eyes begin to close. He suddenly felt very sleepy, and he suspected that something had been mixed into the drink. But despite this, he decided that the most important thing now was to get a good night's sleep and regain his strength for the next day. First, he wanted to think about how he would get out of the situation that had developed in this house. He understood that if he lifted the curse, he could immediately expose himself. When Hiram was already asleep and it was late at night, someone very quietly approached his room in the far wing. But the Demon King was sleeping very soundly and was not vigilant. The door swung open cautiously and light from the corridor filtered into the room. A man in a dark cloak stood on the threshold. Having made sure that Hiram was asleep, he quietly walked inside. Sneaking up, the stranger began to take a blade from under his cloak. As he approached the bed where Hiram slept, the man continued to be careful not to wake the Demon King. The dagger was already at the ready. Hiram heard absolutely nothing. He was sleeping peacefully, and even the light that poured in through the crack left when the door was opened could not wake him up. As the man in the cloak approached, he raised his sword over his head and was ready to take the life of the Demon King who was still sleeping. Everything could be decided in a matter of seconds. So the killer decided not to delay for long and began to bring his blade over the sleeping Hiram. To be sure, the man decided to use a thrust, turning the sword. The blade was already very close and was ready to pierce Hiram through and through, but the speed of the blow gradually began to decrease. The young man had already woken up by that time, but continued to keep his eyes closed. Soon the blade reached Hiram, but only slightly cut his shirt, leaving the guy completely unharmed. The hands that held the sword began to tremble violently. After all this, Hiram finally opened his eyes and said out loud that he had finally had the courage to attempt on him. He was quite calm, realizing that nothing would happen next. The man with the blade continued to tremble, and Hiram recognized the weapon. A muffled apology came from under the hood. Hiram sat up and saw the woman's hands holding his blade. He calmed the stranger and asked what was wrong. Then Hiram rose to his feet and reached out to the blade. He took hold of the hilt and pulled back his hood a little. It was Lumiere, who was already standing and sobbing, not knowing what else to say. Hiram held the sword, but Lumiere, shaking, did not let go. Breaking the silence, Hiram asked why she had stopped, adding that she would have managed if she had not changed her mind. Lumiere was very ashamed and remained silent for a long time. The only words she could repeat over and over were words of apology. She let go of the sword and gave it to the young man. Hiram, holding the blade, waited for an explanation when Lumiere apologized again and reached behind her back where she kept her dagger. She quickly pulled it out, causing Hiram to freeze in surprise, not understanding her intentions. But Lumiere wasn't going to attack Hiram with the blade. She drew it out completely and pointed the tip at herself, resting it against her chest. The girl said that she trusted Selena with it. After that, a heavy sigh followed, and Lumiere swung the blade, stabbing herself in the chest area. She really wanted to do it. But Hiram managed to react and hit the girl on the hand. The blade immediately fell out and began to fly to the floor. Lumiere remained unharmed, not having time to make what would have been a fatal mistake. Lumiere bowed and fell to her knees, tears streaming from her eyes. Hiram, coming closer, asked if the Prime Minister was involved. From her crying, he knew he was right. Hiram continued to move towards Princess Lumiere and began to tell what he had already realized. He said that the girl was told to kill Hiram in exchange for healing Selena. Lumiere, sitting on the floor, confessed that her illness was incurable without a special medicine that the Prime Minister promised to give. She could not refuse him because her younger sister's life was at stake, but she could not kill Hiram because she cared about him. Tears fell like rain on the cold floor. Hiram, holding the blade in his hand, said that it was for this reason that she believed that if he had spotted her, then the girl had no way out at all. She felt so ashamed that she had decided to do such a thing. After all, Lumiere wanted to commit suicide after the Prime Minister's failed request. Hiram said that it was very stupid, for which the girl continued to apologize. After the Demon King stared at her for a very long time without showing much emotion, he soon smiled and told Lumiere not to worry about what happened, as he understood everything. He leaned towards her, continuing to relieve the tension, and told the girl that Selena was already fine. She raised her head, still crying. The girl couldn't believe it. Here she screamed, not understanding what all this meant. She was very interested to hear about everything because the disease was considered for a long time completely incurable. Hiram looked around and said that he had examined the room and the girl herself when they had visited her. He had realized almost immediately that the illness she had thought of was someone's curse. Hiram began to tell the girl that when he entered Selena's room he immediately noticed something strange. That's why he walked around with such a curious look, but in fact he was lifting the curse. The Demon King stood close to the princess and took her hands. The guy said that she had already seen how strong his healing magic was, so he would not deceive her. Lumiere, having told about the curse, began to cry, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Hiram, looking at her, smiled and asked if she believed him, but the princess remained silent for a long time, unable to say anything. Soon, sobbing, the girl shouted that she believed, or rather wanted to believe in it. After all, healing for her sister had been the girl's long-time dream. She was very worried about the girl. Hiram took Lumiere's hand and lifted her up. He quietly said that in that case, if she trusted him, then the princess would have to rely on him and go on. After Hiram began to heal the girl's hand, which he had previously hit, knocking out the dagger, the doors to the room were broken and several people suddenly ran into it. They were court knights, fully armored. Entering the room, they began to surround Princess Lumiere, who was sitting on the floor, and Hiram himself. One of the knights shouted loudly, addressing Her Highness Lumiere Ortville. He said that they had received a report that a girl had attempted to assassinate the king's guest. The girl did not understand what was happening in this room. She continued to watch everything with tears in her eyes, and Hiram shouted that the guards did not dare to enter his room without permission. The knight immediately objected to the guy, telling Hiram not to interfere and that they intended to take the girl right now. But the Demon King would definitely not allow that. Hiram stood before the princess and the guards, and then said that the trial must be held in the presence of the king, and in that case she would have to appear before him in person. After this phrase, the guards seemed to break into chains and everyone in the room began to take out their blades. They shouted that Hiram did not even have a clue what he was talking about. The swordsmen rushed towards the Demon King with their weapons. They intended to finish him off while he was standing there in his pajamas, but Hiram resorted to his magic. He used demon magic, shouting for the guards to get out of his way, calling them inferior. It sounded like an order, and there was an immediate reaction. All the guards in the room immediately knelt before Hiram. They lowered their swords and stood still, waiting for further words from the Demon King. Princess Lumiere was still sitting on the floor, clutching the blade that Hiram had once given her. The boy extended his hand to her and said that it was time for them to go together. The girl gained confidence and began to rise from the floor. Her spirit was lifted and she agreed to follow Hiram further. The princess rose to her feet and they went outside. Running out of the room, they headed towards Selena's chambers. Hiram said that they would have to go to the king tomorrow anyway. The guy said that they could get there riding on Jorma. The girl was worried that there might be a guard standing outside the girl's room. She was worried that something might happen to her little sister too. As they approached the exit of their corridor, the girl saw that the doors and part of the wall had been destroyed. She rushed towards the exit, shouting her little sister's name. As they passed the wall, Lumiere saw a huge ancient dragon looming over Selene's bed, roaring at the servants and guards who were already lying on the ground. The dragon was in complete control of the situation, and the servants and guards were disarmed. Grasping each other, they tried to catch their breath, and some took cover from the dragon. Hiram came out first and immediately praised the dragon. It was Yorm who had grown in size. Lumiere looked at the scene, amazed at everything that was happening. Seeing Selena on the bed, hiding under the blanket, Lumiere immediately ran to her. Jorm hovered over the bed and told Hiram that there was not a single scratch on the girl. Lumiere began to cry again and, clutching Selena's head, hugged her tightly. The girl, crawling out from under the blanket, answered that she was fine. The princess, in turn, asked her sister how she felt. Both hugged, and tears rolled down their cheeks. Hiram began to approach Selena's crib and asked the girl how she felt. Selena stood up and said that everything was great, because she did not even feel any pain. Hiram came up and stroked Selena's head, saying that he was glad to see her, but it was better to postpone the conversation until the morning, since it was already night. Using magic, he put the girl to sleep and she soon fell asleep. Lumiere smiled for the first time in all this time. Hiram said that there was no trace of the illness that had plagued her. She needed a good night's sleep, and now they had to get on the road. Lumiere was very worried about her sister. She hugged her tightly while she was already asleep, saying that the most important thing was that the girl was safe. She prayed for that and was glad that they saved her. Gradually coming to her senses, Lumiere raised her head, looking at Jorm. She thanked him and Hiram for their help. The Demon King at this time sat down on a stone and thought about something. Jorm asked his king what he was thinking. The ancient dragon knew something was wrong and wanted to hear some kind of explanation from his master about what was happening. Hiram said that he had previously thought that the enemy was the prime minister, but now it seemed that there was most likely someone else involved that Hiram did not yet know about. The ancient dragon was surprised by this arrangement. He cried out, wondering what all this could mean. Jorm thought that it was the prime minister who started all this, wanting to take all the sweetness for himself. But Hiram said that in one way it could indeed be so. However, the coincidence of circumstances was too strange, as if everything had been arranged on purpose. He continued by saying that the minister, in general, did not care whether the assassination was successful or not, because in any case, he would get rid of Lumiere and achieve his goal. Lumiere turned to Hiram in surprise, wanting to find out all the details. The girl apologized and asked him to repeat, because she barely understood what he was talking about. Hiram put his hand on her shoulder, smiled and said that he would go to the minister right now and find out everything. It was necessary to sort this out as quickly as possible. The princess looked timidly at Hiram and asked very hesitantly if the minister was expecting them now. Hiram laughed and said that he would have to receive them anyway, no matter what. After Hiram's words, Lumiere shouted that in that case she would go too, because all this was for their own country. The girl was full of determination and wanted to avenge her family. As Jorm and Lumiere looked at Hiram, he began to call upon his magic and said that there was something that needed to be done before they set out. Hiram said that he had to warn the princess that the minister might have prepared and left many traps along the way that would threaten their lives, so they had to act carefully. The Demon King turned around and watched the princess change in mood. The girl suddenly began to feel sad, hanging her head down to the ground. Hiram looked at her questioningly, and then she said that all this time, the girl had been very naive and did not understand at all that her family was in serious danger. The guy wanted to cheer the girl up and put his hand on her shoulder. The Demon King said that she could no longer worry at all because he would help her solve the problems that were engulfing her family. Adding a little volume to his voice, Hiram also added that it was not the princess's fault at all. He thought that the prime minister had been cooperating with the demons for a long time because he felt it. When Hiram said this, Princess Lumiere and Jorm stared at him, waiting for an explanation. The dragon asked his master the reason why he thought so. Hiram began to explain that first of all, the incident with the zombie dragon, the magic that was there was obviously not one that existed in this country. On top of that, the spell that was in Selena's room was demonic magic, so Hiram was able to immediately recognize it, felt it from the inside. After he explained everything, Hiram began to create some kind of magical barrier around Selena's crib. A bright light immediately flashed through the ruined room. He began to lift the crib, wanting to move it to some safe place. He also made sure that no one could disturb Selena during their absence. Afterwards, when everything was ready, he turned to the princess and his dragon and said that now that Selena was safe, it was time to pay a visit to the minister and find out what was going on. Approaching Jorm, Hiram asked his dragon for permission to set out on a journey riding on the dragon. Jorm was delighted and immediately agreed, laughing loudly. The princess was delighted with what was to come. Jorm stretched out his front paws and carefully picked up his king and his companion. He was pleased, saying that it would be the first time he would give Her Highness a ride. Leaving Selena in his room, casting protective magic, Hiram and the princess rushed into the sky, being in the hands of the ancient fire-breathing dragon, Jorm. It was clear that Hiram liked this kind of movement, but the princess crouched down and grabbed the ancient dragon's claw very tightly, worried that she might fall while cutting through the air ahead. The dragon flew across the night sky and approached the royal palace, which was not far from the mansion where Selena lived, especially since on Jorma the journey took only a few minutes. Jorm continued to fly, holding Hiram and Princess Lumiere in his arms. The Demon King already had a plan, because he could not fly inside the palace riding on the ancient dragon. Lumiere continued to sit on her paws, holding her sword tightly. Hiram watched as they got closer and closer to the palace, planning his algorithm of actions and how best to pull it off. The princess's face was very concentrated and tense. She was full of anger towards the elf who oppressed their entire family. In her eyes, one could only read the desire for revenge. But despite all this, her hands were shaking, still clutching the blade. In such agony, it was very difficult to control herself because it affected even her sister, who was still a child. Hiram could see that Princess Lumiere was very tense. He knew she was worried about how things might turn out now. He should have been more tactful at court. Here he decided to lighten the mood a little and asked the princess if she knew where the prime minister might be. The girl said that he should be at a ball at the royal court. Hiram smiled and said that this was a perfect place to set a trap for her. Lumiere replied that this ball for the royal family and aristocrats was organized by her uncle, the Aragerzog. Hiram explained that his target was the Prime Minister and that he did not care about anything else. He suggested that Lumiere stay behind when they got there so as not to risk her position, as charges against the second man in the kingdom would be serious. But Lumiere said that she would definitely go with Hiram, after which the guy picked her up in his arms and said that he would hope for the luck that should accompany them. Afterwards, he walked to the edge of the dragon's paw and looked down. The princess was surprised by such a step, as the next moment Hiram took a step and they went into freefall. Hiram, holding the princess in his arms, was rapidly gaining altitude, heading towards the palace below. Lumiere, trying to hold back, began to scream in fear, not understanding Hiram's plan. The Demon King, remaining calm, smiled slightly, completely in control of the situation. The palace was rapidly approaching, and Hiram aimed for the top floor with its garden and towers with lit windows. Guards were patrolling around, and inside the palace, a ball was taking place. One of the guards looked up and noticed something suspicious. And soon, they were very close to the ground. The princess grabbed Hiram's body tighter, waiting for the landing. The Demon King put one foot forward and was ready to finish the flight. Hiram stood on one leg, softening their landing with special magic. The grass shook a little, and the guards who saw this opened their mouths in surprise and rushed towards them. The other guards also noticed the uninvited guests. They turned their heads and saw the guards already running towards Hiram and the princess. Lumiere, heading towards the guards who began to complain, put out her hand and said that she would take care of the ball herself. The princess took a few more steps forward and placed her hand on her chest. She solemnly said that she was the commander of the 3rd Detachment of the Knightly Order and had come to see the minister on urgent business. One of the guards put his hand on the girl's shoulder and said that even though she was a princess, she would not enter without an invitation. The second shouted that their meeting was impossible and asked to come back another day. Seeing this, Hiram immediately went to help. He grabbed one of the guards by the hand, which he placed on Lumiere's shoulder. He glared at the guard and threw it away. After the guards began to protest, Hiram twisted the hand he had grabbed and said that they had not asked his permission. The boy then pulled the princess forward. As they began to enter, the guards rushed after them and shouted, asking them to wait. The guards called out to the princess, thus notifying everyone present of her visit. The retinue that was inside looked back at the princess and the guest who had walked in with her. Everyone was surprised that Lumiere had come here now, late at night. While the others stood and stared, the rest of the guards began to run from behind the people, wanting to stop Lumiere. All the guests continued to watch, without interfering or standing up for Princess Ortveil. The guards grew in number and soon they surrounded the princess and Hiram, who was standing next to her. Suddenly, from somewhere high above, a voice was heard asking about the source of the noise. It was the Prime Minister himself who was coming down the stairs. He said that the princess was being very rude, barging into the party without even having an invitation. He asked the princess about her unacceptable behavior, looking at the couple. Soon he went down and looked at the girl questioningly, still adding the address, Your Highness. Lumiere rushed forward, saying that she was not there to attend the Prime Minister's sushi event. Meanwhile, Hiram was scanning the area for traps. Having carefully examined the guests, the Prime Minister suddenly turned to the dark-haired youth. He asked if he was Hiram, calling him over. Hiram didn't stand on ceremony for long and praised the minister for coming on his own. Afterwards, Hiram said that if he wanted to kill him, he could try to do it right now. The Prime Minister, leaning on his aristocratic cane, said there was no need to be so nervous. He added that he did not know what Her Highness had told him, but he had not tried to kill anyone. Soon the Prime Minister stood before Hiram, almost face to face. They were surrounded by guards, and behind the Lord were several court magicians who held their wands. The minister said that the boy was very talented despite being a human. He said that if he would swear allegiance to him instead of the princess, he would provide security for the boy. Hiram said that he was not some kind of servant, and, moreover, he did not need anyone's protection. He had come here on a completely different matter, which the minister would soon learn about. Hiram moved on to serious questions, shouting that he was asking questions now and the minister could not ignore them. He looked at the arrogant lord and asked how much fun he had had poisoning the second princess of the Otrevale family. The minister pretended not to understand what he was talking about. Afterwards, Hiram began to shout that the lord could have told him right away about what it was like for him to unite with the demons. Everyone exclaimed in surprise, and Hiram added that, besides, he was the general of the Demon King's army. The minister began to get angry and, stuttering slightly, asked the man who had so boldly shouted throughout the palace whether Hiram had any evidence of what he was talking about. Hiram took a step forward, and the guards immediately prepared to defend him. He said that weaklings like the minister could not make demands on the demon general. The boy explained that people like the minister were just pawns to them. The minister was indignant, shouting that Hiram was talking nonsense. Afterwards, Hiram began to focus magic around his hand and said that it was okay that the minister did not understand him, but his death would cause a lot of trouble for the Demon King's army. Hiram extended his hand, emitting a powerful magical charge. He added that if the Lord died, the Demon King's army would definitely appear before the entire palace, or a little later. The minister was angry and would no longer tolerate or listen to this upstart. He waved to his guards behind him and ordered that Hiram be ground into dust for his insolence towards a high-ranking person. All the magicians who stood behind him charged their wands and pointed them towards Hiram. When the Lord said that the young man was about to die, several fireballs were directed towards him. Hiram stood firm and watched as the fireballs approached him, but he didn't even think of giving in from the whole place. The fire was getting closer and closer, and now it collided with him. A huge explosion thundered in the palace, which destroyed part of the floor where Hiram stood. People began to run away, trying to protect their women and children from the stones that were flying in all directions. Princess Lumiere was also watching the scene unfold. Soon the dust began to clear, and a couple of knights took a few steps forward to where the man was standing. The Lord looked at the explosion and lowered his eyes and said that Hiram was just a small fry who was more of a pathos, provoking him. He believed that this would be indicative for the others. Soon, when the dust had almost completely settled, a hand and a black glove appeared from the epicenter, which belonged to the Demon King. Hiram said that with such forces it would be impossible to defeat him. Hiram shook himself, scattering the dirt that flew around him. All the courtiers and guests at the ball looked on in amazement at what the man who now stood before the Lord could endure. The minister was no less surprised and, opening his mouth wide, shouted that these were the spells of the court magicians and a person simply could not physically survive such a thing. Hiram only smiled at him in response. After the guards rushed towards Hiram, raising their blades high above their heads, the youth repeated, turning to the minister, saying that he had contacted the army of the Demon King and was trying to kill him. The guards caught up with Hiram and a fight began, but this was far from the first time the Demon King dealt with such a threat. Using only the strength of his arms, he quickly dealt with the swordsmen. The knights scattered, pushing aside the mages and other warriors. Hiram continued to throw them around as if they were weighty, like crumpled paper. The Demon King said that he knew how the Lord manipulated the first princess with a hostage and ordered her to kill Hiram while he was sleeping peacefully in his room at night, being a guest. At this time, one of the magicians, who also rushed to attack along with the guards, flew at the Lord and pressed him against the stairs. The minister began to scream, overflowing with anger. Continuing to throw off the body of the court magician, the Lord shouted to his guards to finish him off quickly, but the next moment, Hiram, who was already opposite him, put his foot on the Lord's chest. Hiram smiled and told him not to think that he would get off easy. For what the Lord had done, Hiram would pay him handsomely with the torments and tortures that would reward such dirty deeds. The Demon King continued to look at the terrified Lord and added that he would die slowly and painfully, begging for it to end, but the end was not near yet. Still holding the Lord with his foot, Hiram waited for him to use his secret weapon. The Lord touched the bracelet, which began to glow, and began to call for help from Lord Olgin. The bracelet enveloped the minister in dark magic, emanating from the gem in the center. There was a flash and the Lord screamed in an unnatural voice. His clothes began to tear, and Hiram was thrown back several meters. While the bright light blinded everyone in the hall, the minister continued to call out to Olgin, calling him the leader of the four heavenly lords of light. The Lord's body rose above the stairs, radiating light and darkness. It swelled, changing with each passing second, and black slime flew around. Hiram watched, waiting for this transformation. The princess, grabbing the blade, prepared to defend herself, and through the flash of light, the Lord's cries of pain were heard. Hiram looked at all this and noted to himself that the reception of the head of the four heavenly kings was a complete lack of taste from the set that the demons wielded in his kingdom. Soon, a completely transformed minister appeared before the entire court, his body resembling a monster from the underworld. It looked as if another, much larger body had grown around the small one. Looking at his body, the minister said that he felt great in his demonic form. Hiram said that only a complete idiot could call such a form demonic. The elves in the hall were shocked by what had happened to their minister. No one could have imagined that demons would somehow interfere with the governance of the country. The prime minister's huge new body pointed to the retinue present at the ball. The Lord shouted, calling them low elves, and demanded that they bow down before the Demon King, swearing allegiance to him. One of the men behind Lumiere shouted, saying that it was a bit of a surprise that he was collaborating with the Demon King's army. He asked the reason why he betrayed his homeland. The minister said that this was his revenge. He was constantly humiliated for human blood, but none of them had done as much for the country as he had. He added that the demons rewarded the warriors for their services by promising him the rule of the country if he managed to conquer it. Lumiere screamed and said that if he relied on demons, then she did not understand why he needed her and Selena. The Lord said that it was simply an order from Lord Olgan and he followed his will. Then he said that no matter how much he tried to squash them, they still survived. All he had to do was execute them, or at worst, lock them up in prison, and Mr. Olgan would finally recognize his merits. After what the Prime Minister had said to the girl, Hiram turned to the girl and asked if she had any questions left. The princess said that she had heard enough. Hiram turned back to the Lord and addressed him. He said that now the monster and the former Prime Minister could say goodbye and it was time for him to die. The minister in the house laughed loudly, calling the boy a pathetic little human. The demon said that in his current form he could easily defeat even an ancient dragon. Hiram chuckled and asked the demon if he knew anything about the ancient dragons to speak of them like that, but the Lord clearly wasn't going to tolerate the ridicule of some human any longer. The elf in the form of a demon really looked scary. The huge demonic body repeated the movements of the main one, and then the Lord clenched his fist and shouted for Hiram to be silent. In addition to the blow itself, the minister increased its power with dark magic. The fist flew very fast and soon caught up with Hiram, destroying the floor next to him, which began to fly apart into small pieces. The power was truly devastating. The impact caused such a wave that it flew out of the walls of the tower, sweeping away everything that was behind it. This noise was heard even in the remote corners of the city. After this blow, the Lord burst out through the same hole. He screamed for everyone to see his power. Lumiere covered her father and mother, next to whom she stood. The Lord climbed the highest tower, spread his small wings, and shouted that he would turn all these lands into a scorched wasteland. After that, the Lord began to laugh, raising his head up. Half of the Lord's face was distorted, and he also grew fangs. He continued to shout, saying that all the empty lives of the elves would be a beautiful offering to the Demon King. But suddenly a voice came from behind the Lord. That voice said that he didn't think the Demon King would like such a gift from a dirty servant who was still a pitiful puppet. When the demon turned around, he saw Hiram standing on the thin spire, looking at him. He couldn't believe that the guy had survived his blow, but he intended to finish the man off anyway. Hiram stood there and continued to smile. It was obvious that he saw the minister as nothing more than a laughingstock. He would never gain real power with such arrogance. The demon opened his mouth wide and hissed. He shouted that Hiram didn't even dare to say anything to him now. He wasn't even an elf, just a pathetic human who had come here without asking. The Lord began to concentrate a huge black ball of demonic magic that he wanted to launch at Hiram and destroy him. He knew for sure that this would be enough. The ball gradually grew and became larger. Then the demon pointed his hand towards Hiram, holding a black magic sphere in his hand. Hiram continued to stand still. The demon lord grabbed the roof and flapped his small wings. The orb collided with Hiram, and the Lord continued to hold it in the place where the man stood. Hiram stopped the ball with one hand, without destroying it. Then he pushed the ball forward slightly, and then threw it back sharply towards the former minister demon. The ball rushed towards the demon, pushing him off the roof. The demon flew several meters until the ball finally collapsed. Small wings helped him stay in the air. The demon stopped, spreading his wings and waving his tail from side to side. He couldn't believe that his attack had been blocked, but at the same time, it had been reflected back at him. But unlike Hiram, the Lord was not so unscathed after that. He coughed and blood came out of his mouth. He looked at the guy who was approaching him in surprise. Hiram was hovering in the air and approaching the demon. Hiram spread his arms and decided it was time to introduce himself, and then he said that in front of the Lord was Hiram himself, or rather, the Demon King Hiram. The boy continued to grin, and then added, saying that for a monster like him, it would be a true honor to die at the hands of the Demon King himself under such circumstances. Now Hiram was ready to strike. He raised one hand and began to prepare a magical aura. Meanwhile, the huge body of the Lord fluttered in front of him, supported by small wings. Hiram's aura began to grow, and he slowly and unhurriedly began to approach his opponent. The Lord was full of hatred, but deep in his eyes fear was already visible. The Lord had trouble dodging Hiram's blows, so he was preparing to strike back or defend himself, and then counterattack. He was very determined. But Hiram's speed was inexorably fast. He rushed towards the Lord, who changed his appearance and immediately struck him in the face, directing the force he had concentrated in his hand into him. The demon's huge carcass went towards one of the towers. He hit the wall and fell inside it. The people who were standing under the place where the former minister fell immediately started to run away. But as Hiram had said, he was going to prepare a slow and painful death for the former minister, so the demon king was in no hurry to finish him off too quickly. After the demon broke through the wall and found himself in the tower, Hiram sent a large fireball after it, which destroyed the top of the structure. The demon only managed to raise his hands. He tried to hold back this fiery stream, and for a second, he thought he had succeeded. While the Lord was struggling with the fire, Hiram was gradually heading towards it. After Hiram flew up to the ruined tower, he jumped onto one of the thin walls. He began to circle around, going behind the Lord, catching small drops with his hand. It was the former prime minister's blood that he hadn't noticed yet. Hiram continued to circle around, smiling and gloating at the Lord. He wanted to show him how worthless he had become. The demon looked at Hiram and noticed blood spraying towards him. At first he didn't understand where it was coming from, but when he turned around, he saw his bleeding god. Suddenly, the Lord was pierced by a terrible pain. When he turned around, he found that half of his body was missing and he couldn't comprehend how it happened. Still bleeding, the Lord spat out a huge clot from his mouth, and then said that he did not understand the reason why the lesser creature was able to pierce his flesh. After taking a few steps, the demon soon collapsed, falling from behind the walls of the tower. The fall of his huge body immediately raised dust and sand upward. The elves began to approach closer. He tried to rise, leaning his hands on the floor, the surface of which was completely covered in blood where he lay. The demon groaned pitifully, realizing his defeat. Continuing to spit blood from his mouth, he coughed loudly and did not understand where exactly he had made a mistake. Even with such power, he could not defeat the man. The elves began to run and crowd around, watching the demon die. Everyone began to shout that the prime minister had betrayed his homeland and they were disgracing him. The Lord leaned on his hand and ordered everyone to be quiet. He said that they all knew about his secret affairs and helped him, emphasizing that the blame lay with everyone. After another cough, he shouted that perhaps they themselves did not notice, but in fact they were all useless blockheads who were pushed around like sheep. The demon couldn't calm down and also said that Mr. Olgan and his army were soon to be transported here through the teleportation circle. He believed that in any case, they would all come to an end. After the Lord had spoken, he began to look around, wanting to look into the eyes of everyone who was now standing in front of him. It was as if the demon was overcome with rage, because he had been laughing all this time. But his end was near. When he had said all he wanted and laughed his fill, Hiram snapped his fingers and the Lord died, breathing heavily upward and folding his wings. His Majesty stood with Princess Lumiere, several servants, and Hiram. The king added that what he had witnessed today was a complete abomination. He could not even imagine that he had warmed such a snake. Then the guards ran up to them. They said that they had discovered a giant magic circle northeast of the palace. Monsters were constantly coming out of it. The knights also said that it was necessary to immediately and urgently evacuate all civilians in the city and those who lived outside the city gates. Hiram grabbed Lumiere and ran with her to the dais on the wall. He realized that the prime minister was telling the truth. A huge teleporter loomed over the clearing and grew larger and larger. The servants began to squeal that now was the time to flee, suggesting that the Lord take advantage of the Archduke's help and ask for shelter. Someone thought that if they surrendered, they would be spared. Hiram appeared before the people and solemnly declared that all the people should remain calm. He announced that he would protect the capital, so now the people could take refuge somewhere in the city. Many doubted that the guy would be able to help them alone, but Hiram only added with a grin that everyone should remain good boys and girls, so they could wait here quietly. The princess supported her companion, telling everyone that they had already seen Hiram's strength, and therefore unnecessary panic was inappropriate. Lumiere glanced at the assembled people and stopped at her father. Proclaiming loudly, she gave everyone her word that Mr. Hiram would certainly win today. It worked, and everyone started to smile a little even though the royal palace was destroyed. They wanted to believe that soon everything would pass and they could return to normal life. Hiram raised his head high, smiled and called his dragon, commanded Jorm to come to him immediately. Hiram was going to give a real fight. Jorm arrived on his great wings, scattering the wind to the sides. The ancient dragon had long been waiting for the moment when he could return to his true form and take up the fight. The dragon carefully flew up to the tower and held on to the ledge. Everyone standing nearby screamed in fear, and the dragon began to examine the people around him. Yorm loomed over the servants and the royal family, determined, while Hiram stood quietly in his place, waiting for the dragon to bow its head so he could mount it. And so the ancient dragon flew up to his king. Hiram looked up and said that it looked like the Demon King's army had already arrived. They needed to be dealt with, so he asked Jorm to give them a ride. Yoram exclaimed joyfully that everything would be done and bowed his head slightly. Hiram and Princess Lumiere climbed onto his neck, grasping the thick scales. When they were settled on top, everything was ready to go. Hiram stroked the dragon and gave the command to move on. The dragon began to rise carefully from the ground, flapping his huge wings. He asked about the direction they were moving and the king ordered them to fly northeast. The dragon nodded cautiously and rushed towards the portal from which small dark spots continued to fly out. Obviously, these were the monsters that were landing on the surface. The portal continued to work without stopping. It kept throwing out more and more creatures, and Yoram was hurrying as much as he could. The army began to gather in the small clearing where they had all landed. The army formed a circle, leaving an empty space for those who would come after them. The army of monsters consisted of a variety of creatures. The main ones were the orcs already familiar to the princess, as well as various animals with armor on them. Yoram flew over their heads. Hiram looked at this crowd, which represented the servants of General Olgan. Most likely, the orcs represented the subjugated people on the continent of demons. Hiram praised Olgan for his success in transformation magic, noting that the soldiers' bodies had been rebuilt to be the most efficient, disposable pawns. Princess Lumiere, clutching her scales, admitted that the sight was quite terrifying. The dragon, flying over the crowd, asked his king if it was worth burning those below. Hiram didn't understand what else they could be waiting for here, and so he immediately told his dragon that he could safely do it. Afterwards, the dragon began to gather fire in his mouth and said that he could be relied upon. Having prepared his fiery breath, the ancient dragon splashed it on those standing below. The orcs began to melt. Difficult chocolate under this napalm, and Yorm constantly advanced. While various monsters continued to emerge from the portal, Yoram had already dealt with most of Olgan's army. He formed several rings of fire around the landing site. Lumiere exclaimed in surprise, finally seeing the true power that the ancient dragon possessed. Hiram said that they were like the living embodiment of disaster, and all because of their power. Soon, larger monsters began to emerge from the portal. Several dragons also flew out of it, and another one began to emerge behind them, which had more than one head. It was Olgan himself, the general of the demon army. He was riding a hydra, which looked more like a dragon, but with several heads. His creature also had armor made of bones. Jorm saw several flying dragons fly out of the portal and immediately directed his fiery breath in their direction. He scorched the flying part of General Olgan's army. Most of the army remained unharmed thanks to the magical shield that Olgan had used to protect himself and the nearby dragons. This shield was similar to the one Hiram had used in the cave during his first battle with Yoram, but now that he was human, Hiram could activate all of his seals much more vividly. General Olgan smiled and said, looking at the dragon, that it was, to put it mildly, weak. He chuckled, making the dragon feel embarrassed, but the king asked him not to pay attention to it. Hiram said that this was already his opponent, therefore he would deal with him himself. Princess Lumiere looked at the Demon King and for the first time began to truly worry about him. Previously, she thought that there was no serious threat to Hiram here in her kingdom, but now someone who was similar in strength to the Demon King had arrived, so it was worth thinking about. Yoram continued to fly and saw Hiram preparing to march. The ancient dragon asked his master if he knew the demon that had come out of the portal. Hiram looked at Olgan, smiled and said that yes, he did know. The Demon King was already impatient to go and meet him as soon as possible. Descending from the dragon and walking on air with the help of magic, Hiram instructed Yor to continue shooting at the monsters around him. Then he turned to the princess. He also had a task for her, to watch for those who tried to escape from the fire of the ancient dragon and finish them off. Yoram looked at his king with obedient eyes, and after a moment Hiram turned to face them. The king smiled and said that he was counting on them. Jorm happily shouted that they would easily defeat the demon general's army. Lumiere rather hesitantly shouted that she agreed with Jorm, but apparently she was still worried. Watching his dragon and Princess Ortveil go, Hiram soon immediately turned his attention to General Olgan, who advanced to meet him without making either of them wait. Standing on his hydra, Olgan addressed Hiram, claiming to recognize the former Demon King. According to him, neither Hiram's face nor his mana had changed from the past. However, the demon expressed displeasure at Hiram becoming human. Olgan declared that he considered Hiram's transformation into a human a disgrace and refused to swear allegiance to such a pathetic and weak creature. Hiram looked at the general and calmly said that he did not even want his loyalty and he did not need such a pathetic companion who orders immoral acts. Hiram stared at General Olgan, saying his name very dryly after all the words. The general stared at Hiram for a moment and then began to purse his lips aggressively. Hiram continued to stand in front of General Olgan's Hydra and look him in the eyes. The general himself was impressed that Hiram immediately called him by name and remembered him. Olgan asked Hiram about this, why he had named him. Hiram grinned and said that he remembered it well. Olgan was clearly unhappy about this. Afterwards, Hiram began to remember and said that Olgan was a member of the Secretariat. Olgan Cheptoy is the 4th-class secretary of the demon race that was at the court during Hiram's reign. Olgan, who looked different then and was much younger, was still recognized by Hiram. After the conversation, Hiram asked him with a smile if he was right. The general trembled, his hands clenched into fists. After a pause, he replied that he considered it an honor that Hiram remembered him. Hiram chuckled, stating that the Demon King does not forget those who served him. The mention of the king's title infuriated Olgan. Olgan started shouting at Hiram not to say such nonsense anymore. This really made him very angry, and after a few seconds he continued speaking. Olgan said that he still thinks of himself as a ruler. But Hiram, despite all this, could not even imagine how they, the demons, survived the last 500 years in this world. He continued to shout and said that 500 years ago, Hiram fought with their god and killed him. Because of him, they eventually lost their divine protection and their magic grew weaker day by day. During the time Hiram ruled and then disappeared, there were many races under their protection that they controlled. Demons were considered the highest link in the whole chain. The other nations, when the battle between Hiram and the demon god took place, thought that this was their chance and began to attack the demons while they had the opportunity. Naturally, they, the demons whose powers had been lost, had no way to suppress the resistance of other nations. In just a few years, they had lost most of their lands, including Ortville. After a short pause, Olgan continued, telling how they, once the rulers of the world, were forced to flee like rats to their tiny continent and begin to rebuild their position. The general shouted that they had lost their magic, their lands, and that he was the reason for it. All of this happened because of the selfish desire to fight the demon god. Olgan shouted Hiram's name, saying that he had no right to call himself the Demon King now after what he had done to his people by leaving for 500 years. Hiram silently continued to listen to Olgan. Without raising his head, he calmly said that there were exactly 100 of them every day. Olgan did not understand what was being said. Then Hiram began to explain to Olgan that the divine patronage that the general so craved was very expensive for them at that time, and many did not think about it seriously. Hiram remembered that his predecessor had received favor in exchange for demon lives, sacrificing 100 every day, including children, and all this was taken as normal. These lives were given to the god of demons. Hiram was overcome with emotion, and when he raised his head, he also began to scream. He asked Olgan if he had ever thought about what it was like for his brothers. The general declared that it was a reasonable sacrifice to give the lives of commoners to the demon god. He considered it an honor beyond what a commoner could ever imagine to be food for the deity. Hiram interrupted him, saying that he had had enough. Olgan had his title, but he valued it more than the lives of his men. Hiram began to prepare for battle and said that this was absolutely unforgivable behavior for a demon commander. He added that only death would earn the general's forgiveness. Hiram's words sent General Olgan into a fit of hysterics. He began to laugh mockingly, mocking him. Then he asked if he really was going to kill him. After laughing, Olgan threw his head back and fixed his hair. Looking back, he noticed that in his past life, Hiram had been invincible, but now everything had changed. Olgan contemptuously believed that such an inferior race would not be able to defeat him. This self-confidence and naivety were characteristic of many demons. Hiram grinned and told Olgan to come to him and personally check how much Hiram had weakened. After that, the general commanded the dragons to get ready. Olgan shouted that he was the leader of the 4 heavenly kings. No man could ever match his strength. The dragons opened their mouths and prepared to attack Hiram with fire. The dragons in bone armor began to attack Hiram with their fiery breath. They all began at the same time, and their attack gradually overtook the former demon king. Hiram remained where he was as the fire moved towards him in a blinding flash. He began to charge the magical flow. The young man was ready to defend himself. And so the fire caught up with Hiram. General Olgan watched intently as Hiram's body plunged into the fire. The power of several dragons was far greater than the attack of one. Hiram put up his shield and the fire went around him, leaving him unharmed. The general was able to foresee this and then, snapping his fingers, continued his planned attack. A pair of huge demons immediately appeared behind Hiram, raising their axes above their heads. The general hoped that Hiram would not have time to leave and that Olgin would catch him off guard. But Hiram managed to react and turn to the attackers. Without any weapons, but only his own magical power, Hiram divided two large demons in half. At that moment, one of the dragons was already flying towards him, which, like the demons, had horns. Apparently, these creatures were indeed transformed by the demon commander's magic. The dragon swallowed Hiram, but after a few seconds, a gash appeared on his head and blood gushed out. The demon king took an axe wielded by one of the big guys and cut the dragon in half. The monsters rushed to attack in complete disarray. Among them were dragons, transformed doors, and orcs. They stretched out their arms, opened their mouths, and approached Hiram. He continued to fight, fending off the attackers. Meanwhile, General Olgin prepared to strike a blow aimed at the demon king. Hiram managed to defend himself by putting up a shield. He looked at the general with a smile, showing him that his strength was still good and the guy had not weakened. Olgin made a gesture with his finger. When the general saw Hiram looking at him, he began to point his fingers downwards. Hiram, holding his shield in front of him, looked back and saw several dragons preparing to attack him. Hiram then charged at them and slammed into the ground, cutting through everything in his path. The impact created a massive blast wave, and whatever was underneath Hiram was blown to pieces. After the Demon King landed, he leaned on his hand and started to rise. Hiram smiled, saying that the general showed him a pretty good attack and a planned strike. But since Hiram was still alive, this did not suit General Olgin. He flew up on his dragon, and the beast put out a paw. He intended to grab Hiram and immobilize him. Hiram managed to see this and quickly dodged, after which the general ordered his dragons to keep the fire charge inside. The dragons were ready to attack. Olgin thought he had found the perfect solution, and his dragons released a fiery breath straight at Hiram. The general screamed with hatred, demanding the death of his opponent. The final attack of the dragon's three heads slammed Hiram into the ground. Believing the battle to be over, the general began to lower his pet to the ground. Smoke continued to rise from the heads of the dragons, which landed where the blow had landed. The general carefully examined the place where Hiram had fallen and could not believe his eyes. Hiram was standing on his feet, only slightly sunken into the ground. The king mockingly asked if the general had run out of worthy attacks. The general asked Hiram why he thought so, but his voice was already shaking slightly. In turn, the Demon King said that it was his turn now and released a magical whirlwind at Olgin. The blow had devastating force and area. Hiram used both hands and pushed it forward, aiming it at General Olgin and his three-headed dragon. Hiram was sinking deeper into battle madness. A wide smile was visible on his face. It was a matter of principle for her to show Olgin that he was a non-entity compared to him. A huge aura rushed towards the general, pushing him and the dragon back. Olgin grabbed the beast's neck, trying to turn it around to fly away, but it was too late for such a maneuver. Afterwards, the aura that had moved towards Olgin exploded, and fragments began to fly in all directions. The only thing the general managed to do was to put his hands in front of himself and scream. Yorm continued the battle, flying around the battlefield and continuing to burn all those who came out of the portal. The dragon that the general was riding on fell, cutting a hole in the ground. Stones flew in all directions, and Yorm, noticing this, commented that nothing else could be expected from His Majesty. The dragon rejoiced in victory, and the princess continued to fight the remaining monsters. The girl felt a gust of wind coming from where General Olgin fell. Raising her sword, she turned in that direction and quietly said Hiram's name. The stones continued to fly apart, and a strong magical energy was concentrated around the place where the dragon had fallen. A huge dark spot was visible at the place where the dragon had stopped. Olgin was covered by one of the lower demons that served in his army. Spreading its wings, the general stepped forward, denying that he had lost today. The general took a few steps forward on the ground that had just been destroyed and said that he was Olgin Chaptoy and was the head of the 4 heavenly kings of the demon army. Olgin continued to lose blood and soon heard Hiram's voice. The demon king noted that the general's strength had not changed at all and remained the same as it had been 500 years ago. Hiram was floating in the air, sitting on one of the boulders that had flown up after his magical attack. He expressed disappointment. Hiram said that Olgin was too weak. All this time he only relied on the power of a god, and he himself had not advanced at all in the last 500 years. The Demon King angrily shouted that demons did not have to depend on their god forever. He indignantly said that they were incapable of restoring what was lost by their own strength. Afterwards, Hiram came down and began to approach the general. He wanted to be sure that he was listening. Hiram said that he had once been his subject, so he would show mercy and kill him quickly. General Ulmang cleared his throat and spat out blood. Then he decided that he had something he could give Hiram one last time and asked if he had a daughter. Hiram looked at him in surprise and asked if he was talking about Philphy. The general laughed and said yes, he was talking about her. He suggested that Hiram call the girl here. Hiram tensed up a little. He didn't understand why General Olgin decided to talk about this now. Something was definitely wrong, but nevertheless, Hiram agreed. Olgin knew that interest would get the better of the Demon King. He grabbed the amulet that hung around his neck and said that he would do as Hiram wished. Grabbing the amulet with a skull in the center, the jewel immediately began to glow strongly. General Olgin began to chuckle quietly, continuing to look at Hiram's face. Then he raised the amulet up and began to open a huge portal. Hiram thought for a second that this could be another trick that the demon had prepared. Light began to illuminate everything around. The magic contained in the amulet was very strong. Many demonic symbols, enclosed in circles, began to appear in the sky. Hiram raised his head and watched what was about to happen. He saw something appear from the portal, thinking it was a demon god. He also felt the magic that began to hover around. Hiram was greatly surprised and turned to Olgin, asking him what it all meant. Olgin began to shout that he had already told Hiram what it was. It was his dearest daughter, Lady Philphy. The body of the demon god in shackles began to emerge from the portal. Soon, the entire body of the deity appeared before him. The flow of mana grew stronger all around, and each step of the creature shook the earth, burning the places where his foot landed. Hiram looked up at the silhouette of the demon god and couldn't believe what he saw. The god had to be reborn and gain power much later than he did. But at that moment, while Hiram was thinking, his necklace, which connected him magically to Philphy, began to burn with a bright green fire, indicating the presence of a girl next to him. Hiram grabbed it and felt the necklace shaking violently. The Demon King began to guess what had happened to the girl he cared for. General Olgin then turned to His Majesty and said that he must have noticed that the general was good at transformation magic. He was also excellent at body enhancement magic. Olgin laughed and said that Hiram's daughter now served as a vessel for the soul of their shared deity. The general continued to gloat, calling on Hiram to rejoice. He explained that he had used all his talent to make Lady Philphy the most powerful being. Hiram's face began to change dramatically when he learned what the general had done. Hiram became truly furious. His body also transformed and Hiram had his old horns. He shouted Olgin's name and rushed towards him with all his might.